class are able to actually use them. And at number 10, we have Mage Hand. This cantrip is either incredibly convenient and useful in all kinds of situations, or it only provides incredibly minor conveniences. You see, what this spell does is it allows you to create a floating spectral hand, and you can use this hand to move stuff around as long as whatever it's moving weighs less than 10 pounds. It only lasts a minute, can only go out to around 30 feet, and can't be used to attack or activate magic items. Now, what makes this cantrip so useful is the fact that it can kind of trivialize a lot of traps you might come across in dungeons. If you need to pick up an item that you think might have some kind of trap associated to it, you can just have your mage hand do it while you stay safely 30 feet away. And it's able to trigger a lot of traps you might come across. But there are some DMs who might make an item exactly 11 pounds, for example, so that you can't use mage hand to trivialize their traps, or some other minor change that you can't use mage hand to get out of every situation. So it's really as useful as you are creative with using it, or what your DM will let it accomplish. And Mage Hand gets even more useful if you're an Arcane Trickster rogue. You see, Arcane Tricksters have this thing called Mage Hand Ledger Demane, which makes Mage Hand accomplish a whole bunch of other more complicated tasks, where the hand can be invisible and make other things invisible if they're able to completely cover the object. You can use Mage Hand to use your Thieves' tools, which makes them even better at dealing with traps in dungeons, as oftentimes traps will be attached to a door that needs to be unlocked, and you can even use it to steal stuff at range, as it allows you to perform sleight of hand checks with it. Although you need 3 levels in Rogue in order to accomplish these things, so baseline Mage Hand can be incredibly convenient, but you also kind of need a lenient DM or a very creative mind. And at number 9, we have Word of Radiance. Word of Radiance is an AoE cantrip that can only be used by clerics, or other classes if you take the Magic Initiate feat, and it allows you to do 1d6 radiant damage to all targets within 5 feet of the caster, assuming they fail a Constitution save, as all cantrips with saving throws are all or nothing situations, where you either take all the damage or none of the damage. And while 1d6 damage isn't a lot, it is one of the few AoE cantrips in the game, and it does that ever so important radiant damage. Radiant damage is one of the least resisted types of damage, although I should say it's not the least resisted type. But another good distinction about radiant damage is that a lot of monsters who have the ability to regenerate or heal do not regenerate if they've taken radiant damage in the last turn. So it's a really good way to shut off a lot of healing from different types of monsters. Or I guess I should say not a good way, you do have to get a little close to use a Word of Radiance, and Sacred Flame might be better if all you need is radiant damage, since it's a ranged attack cantrip that does 1d8 damage with a 60-foot range. But Word of Radiance can hit multiple targets, and also has the added feature where it can sometimes shut down healing. Although that damage is really low, and if you really need to attack multiple targets, it might be better to just use a leveled spell. But if you're surrounded by a swarm or a whole bunch of low HP minions, this is a convenient way to maybe kill all of them without having to use a spell slot, or at the very least whittle them down a bit. This spell does scale with your level, going all the way up to 46 damage at level 17, so if you use it at high levels, it can definitely kill low HP minions very quickly. But at high levels, you'll probably have easy access to leveled spells, so you probably won't worry too much about having an AoE cantrip, which is why this is kind of low on the list. Out of the very few AoE cantrips, this one hits about as hard as all the others, and also has a pretty good damage type. And at number 8, we have Message. Message is a cantrip that allows you to send secret messages easier, as long as someone is within 120 feet of you, and not blocked by closed solid objects. You can whisper a message to them, where only the target can hear whatever you told them, and the more important part is that they can also reply in a whisper that only you can hear. So as long as one person has this cantrip, they can hold a private conversation with someone else who doesn't have the cantrip, since it allows them to speak back and forth as long as one person casts it. Now, it's not like telepathy, so other creatures can see you talking if they can't hear it, and while you don't need line of sight on the target, they do kind of have to be in an openish space for the message to work, so it's not super effective at coordinating things from across large buildings or dungeons. But there are lots of situations in which you'd want to have a private conversation where no one else can hear you. Like if you're in a political intrigue campaign and you wish to talk to someone about something important in the middle of a party, but you don't want anyone else to listen in. Message is perfect for those kinds of situations. Or if you're in front of a large enemy group and you're attempting to talk your way out of it, you can formulate a strategy with one other person in your group without accidentally making the aggressive enemy group in front of you more angry. Although, if your DM allows you to make all of these arrangements in front of enemy groups without them hearing anything you say anyway, from like a meta standpoint, it's probably not as useful. But it's also useful for party members to talk to each other. Sometimes you need to coordinate things across the room or across the street in the middle of the city. That message can kind of work like a walkie-talkie, to an extent. Being able to share information is super valuable, and for doing it on a cantrip that doesn't require a spell slot is pretty convenient. And at number 7, we have Spare the Dying. This is a cantrip that only artificers and clerics can use, which allows you to stabilize a party member who's rolling death saves, just as long as you're able to touch them and use this cantrip. And if you're a Grave Domain cleric, it has a 60-foot range and can be used as a bonus action, which is really where it's best used. Now, one of the best uses of this is that you don't need to use a healer's kit or rely on a medicine check DC 10 in order to stabilize someone. It's just a one and done stabilize someone without worrying about them dying. It is better to just heal someone in order to stabilize them, as Spare the Dying doesn't actually bring them back into the battle. It just stops them from having to roll death saves. However, there are no healing cantrips, and if you don't have an available spell slot, this is kind of the best you can do. And it's also kind of important for at least one person to be able to do something like Spare the Dying, or to just have some kind of heal, because it's not really a good idea to let someone rely on death saves, as there's so few ways to increase the modifiers or gain advantage on those rolls. And even if you do have a healer, it could still be useful. Say, for example, 2 of your party members go down. You can use Healing Word on one of them with your bonus action, and then you Spare the Dying on the other one with your regular action. One of them gets to join the battle, and the other one no longer has to worry about rolling death saves. And at number 6, we have Shillelagh. This is a cantrip that only druids can use, or other classes if they have a way to take cantrips from other classes, which is one of the few bonus action cantrips in the game, which allows you to convert a club or quarterstaff made of wood into a magical version of it that deals 1d8 damage. And it also allows you to use your spellcasting modifier instead of strength for the attack and damage rolls. Now, all of this is actually super good. This could be one of the only ways to get a magical weapon if you're low level and facing off against that monster that's resistant to non-magical weapons. Since it allows you to use your spellcasting modifier for those rolls, that allows spellcasters to have a decent melee option at early levels, in case they're forced into melee range. And it also does good damage for a one-handed weapon, as the quarterstaff does have the option to be used one-handed. You see, 1d8 is the same as a rapier or a longbow. A rapier is the highest damaging one-handed finesse weapon in the game, with its d8 dice damage, and the longbow is the highest damaging bow, with a 1d8 damage. So a d8 is kind of the upper limit for a lot of non-two-handed weapons or crossbow weapons. So being able to create a magic weapon that uses your spellcasting modifier and deals good damage is a lot of good stuff packed into one. The spell does only last 1 minute, but that is generally enough time to last an entire battle, especially since you just need to use your first bonus action in order to apply this effect to a weapon. Or it can even be done before combat starts. Although, one of the problems with this is generally spellcasters aren't going to want to do melee damage at all, even if they can use their spellcasting modifier, because chances are they won't have any kind of multi-attack or any other features that combo well with the weapon. So it's incredibly good for a cantrip, but it's probably not something you want to go out of your way to use like you do some of the higher spots on this list, especially since it doesn't really scale in the late game. And at number 5, we have Toll the Dead. Toll the Dead is potentially the hardest hitting cantrip in the game, as what it does is force one target to perform a wisdom saving throw, and if they fail, they take damage depending on what their maximum hit point value is. If they are at maximum hit points, they take 1d8 necrotic damage, which, hey, isn't half bad, but if they are below max health, then they take 1d12 necrotic damage, which is the highest damage dice out of all the cantrips. And since it requires a saving throw instead of an attack, it's actually a lot better to use on a whole bunch of monsters who have high AC values, and probably have pretty low wisdom saves. Wisdom is generally not a stat that a lot of monsters have a high amount of, so it's going to be very dependent on whatever campaign you're running with how successful this one cantrip will be or not. But if you want one of the hardest hitting cantrips, since most of the time you'll be using this on monsters that are not at full health, Toll the Dead is kind of one of the best options to take if you don't have any other class abilities or items that modify the damage of some of your other damaging cantrips. And there's also the whole thing where it can potentially do no damage if they do make the save. But that's the same for all damaging cantrips, so I wouldn't really count that as a negative. It can only be used by 3 classes, but that's not super restrictive. So not all spellcasters have access to it, but the ones that do can't really go wrong with this one as one of their damaging options. especially since this does also scale, like most other damaging cantrips, ending off at 4d12 damage at level 17 and above. And at number 4, we have Chill Touch. Now, despite the name of this cantrip, it actually has a 120 feet range and not a range of touch, which is pretty far for a cantrip. Toll the Dead only has a 60 foot range, for example. And what it does on an attack roll is if it hits, it deals 1d8 necrotic damage. 1d8 is lower than something like Firebolt, which deals 1d10 damage on a ranged attack roll. And the benefit Chill Touch has over something that does a little bit more damage is that if you land the attack, the target can't regain hit points until the start of your next turn. And it also has the extra bonus effect, where undead targets hit by it have disadvantage on attack rolls against you until the end of your next turn. Although it's that whole cannot regain hit point thing that makes this such a powerful cantrip. Players will take Chill Touch for that one effect alone, because there's lots of high-level monsters that have natural healing, and this just completely prevents that from happening without needing to have a specific type of damage to counter it, like radiant or fire damage. It also prevents them from getting healed by other things as well, so they can't have a backup healer bringing them up to full HP with one super once per day heal, like the Narzugon's healing ability, for example. It's honestly a good idea for at least one person to have Chill Touch in your party, especially if you're about to go into a big boss fight that you know might have healing. The fact that it also deals decent-ish damage on top of this, as Chill Touch does scale with its levels as well, is kind of icing on the cake. The only things that really beats Chill Touch when it comes to good cantrips would probably only be the top 3, but even those could be arguable. And at number 3, we have Prestidigitation. This is probably one of the most versatile spells you can pick up, as it basically allows you to do one of any minor magical effect that you can think of. So it's really as good as you are creative at using it, but outside of just being creative with it, one of the more actual useful instances of it is the fact that it can basically be used as a quick shower. So if you just got into a bloody fight, you need to convince some people coming by that you're not murderers, Prestidigitation can clean the blood off almost instantly. It could even make you smell good if you need to go into a noble's house, for example, to ask for a favor, because chances are you probably smell really bad if you're an adventurer. Now, it has a whole bunch of different effects listed on it. It allows you to create a puff of wind, low musical notes, an odd odor, light or put out candles, chill, flavor or warm up food, or even make marks or color appear on surfaces. And there's this one little thing with Prestidigitation where it says it allows you to make a symbol on an object or surface for 1 hour, but it doesn't specify the size of the symbol. So if you want to be annoying to your DM, you could argue that it allows you to create a symbol on the side of an entire building with one cast of it, or the entirety of a dungeon floor, so that you can track an invisible creature or something. I wouldn't recommend using it this way, but it doesn't give specifications on how big you can make it, so you could kind of argue that it works that way. And you can have up to 3 effects of it at a time, so there's just lots of creative ways to use it. And there's 2 other similar cantrips to Prestidigitation. There's also Thaumaturgy and Druidcraft, which are able to do a whole bunch of other minor magical effects. So if you want to be able to do one of almost any minor magical thing, taking all 3 of these cantrips would probably accomplish that. But if you can only pick one, Prestidigitation is arguably the best of the 3. And at number 2, we have Guidance. This cantrip allows you to touch a willing creature in order to give them the buff, which allows them to add a d4 to any one ability check of their choice at the next minute. Now, what's really good about this cantrip is the fact that a lot of ability checks are done outside of combat, and you can use it an unlimited amount of times. If you need to make any kind of skill check outside of combat, and you have someone in your group that has Guidance, you basically always have an additional 1d4 to that skill check, which is just so valuable that Guidance is arguably the best cantrip in the game. And the only reason I have it at number 2 is because this one is kind of reliant on your DM as well. They might not let you use Guidance in a whole bunch of different kinds of situations. Like if you need to perform a persuasion roll, they'll probably disallow using Guidance to add a d4 to it. Or in any other kind of social situation, which is totally fair. The enemy party would be able to see someone casting this as it does have a verbal component to it. But it does also last for a minute, so if you're creative with it and think ahead, you could just cast it in secret, and then they'll just have that roll for the next minute as long as you concentrate on it. Although even if your DM doesn't like it and disallows it in a whole bunch of situations, mechanically speaking, there's still lots of advantages to it in so many other kinds of non-social situations. Performing skill checks happens all the time. It also allows the person to cast it on themselves, so you basically have an unlimited additional d4 rolls to everything outside of combat. There are only 3 classes that can use it: Artificers, Clerics, and Druids, so there is the chance that no one in your party will be able to take a Guidance, but if you do have someone of those 3 classes, there's a good chance they're taking this cantrip unless someone else already has it. This isn't really one that everyone in the party needs to have. Kind of one of those things where only one person needs to have it, unless they just never use it on anyone else. And at number 1, we have Eldritch Blast, which should basically just be a baseline Warlock ability and not a cantrip. Now, this is basically just a damaging cantrip, so Guidance would be more useful than it depending on what kind of campaign you're running. But when it comes to damaging cantrips, Eldritch Blast is kind of one of the best. It doesn't hit the hardest out of all of them. That would probably be Toll the Dead with its D12 damage. But Eldritch Blast deals 1d10 force damage, which is the least resisted type of damage in the game. So there's a good chance Eldritch Blast is going to work on whatever you're using it on. It has a 120-foot range, just like most other long-range cantrips, and it has the special distinction when you're at higher levels, where instead of the cantrip dealing extra damage at higher levels, it just kind of allows you to fire extra Eldritch Blasts with each cast. You see, it's kind of a little bit complicated. When you're at level 17, normally the damage dice would be 3 times higher, so Firebolt would deal 4d10 damage on a single attack roll. But with Eldritch Blast, the same action would deal 1d10 force damage 4 times, which requires 4 separate rolls. And what's great about this is you can direct all 4 of those rolls into multiple targets, so you could hit 4 different enemies with a single cast of Eldritch Blast. Or you could pull them all into one target and just have more chances to roll for crits, which is super valuable. Although you're not actually casting 4 different Eldritch Blasts, more like it separates when you cast one of them into 4 bolts, so you can't use 2 of the bolts and then save the other 2 for moving into a different room in order to attack 2 new targets you just saw. You have to use them all at once, but you can direct them to 4 different targets. And this is a very valuable distinction with things that add damage to all hits, like some of the Warlock Eldritch invocations. You see, some people will take 2 levels in Warlock just to get Eldritch Blast and Warlock invocations, because they have like 5 different invocations that specifically only affect Eldritch Blast. That's why I said it's basically a Warlock ability. One of them allows you to add your spellcasting modifier damage to each bolt, which means if you fire 4 of them at level 17 and above, and you have a charisma modifier of +5 as an example, that's an additional 20 damage since it fires 4 separate bolts. There is also an invocation that allows you to push a target 10 feet away from you each time you hit with Eldritch Blast, which does work on each separate bolt, so attacking them with all 4 of them at high levels could allow you to push one target back 40 feet, which could even allow you to push targets off of cliffs. The invocations are pretty good on Eldritch Blasts, and they're what makes this cantrip shine as one of the best cantrips in the game. Although if you take away the invocations and you just look at baseline Eldritch Blast, it's still a pretty decent damage option that has a unique scaling method in the late game, but it does technically have the potential to do less damage than Toll the Dead, so it's really the invocations that make this ability shine. Although only Warlocks can take Eldritch Blast, so there's a good chance you'll have the invocations if you have 2 levels in Warlock, as you get 2 of them once you hit level 2. So, if you're of a different class and you have the ability to take Eldritch Blast, you probably wouldn't want to do that unless you just really like force damage or the multiple hits thing you can do. So if including at least level 2 Warlock invocations, Eldritch Blast is definitely the best cantrip in the game. Though Guidance could easily be argued as more useful in a less combat-focused campaign, so it really all depends on what kind of game you're running. In this video, we'll be going over the best first level spells in the game, with a focus on more utility spells, since most of the damage spells all do around the same amount of damage at this level anyway. And at number 10, we have Armor of Agathys. This is basically a cold shield and is only available to Warlocks, where it puts a bubble up for 1 hour, which gives you 5 temporary hit points and gives an effect that whenever you're hit by a melee attack while the shield is up, whoever hits you automatically takes 5 cold damage. And since the spell does not require concentration, you don't have to worry about taking damage ending the spell early. Although once you lose the temporary hit points, then the cold damage component goes away as well. So at level 1, with only 5 temporary hit points, it's not that good to be honest. It's real easy for a creature to destroy the armor in 1 hit and only take 5 damage in retaliation, which is okay for a first level spell, but it's not a lot of damage. Where the ability really shines is its higher level casting, as it's one of the best scaling abilities in the game. As when you cast it at 2nd level, it literally doubles the shield and damage component, as it increases by 5 for every level above 1. So if used at 3rd level, then you get 15 temporary hit points and also deal 15 cold damage to creatures each time they attack you. So let's say you're a level 3 warlock and you cast the ability at 2nd level, and you're going against an enemy who hits for around 5 damage each attack. If they attack you twice, they break the armor, but they take 20 damage in retaliation. If you cast the ability at 1st level, it would have broken after the first hit and they would have only have taken 5 damage. Literally casting it 1 level higher allows you to deal 4 times as much damage as its 1st level counterpart against the same enemy. And this is the power of Armor of Agathys. It scales ridiculously well at higher levels when compared to other things which definitely don't increase as much. A normal spell might do like 3d8 damage plus 1d8 damage per level increase, whereas Armor of Agathys just adds more of the original on top of it. And as long as you have any amount of the temporary hit points, it will do the full damage on a melee hit. So if you're level 3 and going against a target and they deal 9 damage on each hit, and they hit you twice, you'll still do 20 full damage back to them in retaliation, even though you only had 1 temporary hit point left for that second attack. And here's the thing about warlocks. Their class by design has this little mechanic where they always cast spells at their highest level, because they basically only have 2 spell slots. Armor of Agathys was kind of designed for warlocks, hence why only they can pick it, since they can cast it at higher levels by just using a spell slot like normal. And it's honestly not that good for other classes that are trying to take the spell from the warlock spell list. So because the spell scales really well at higher levels, and is only available to a class which always casts the highest level spell slot versions of their spells, that's why it's considered a really good level 1 spell, even if it's not very good if cast in its based version at level 1. And at number 9, we have Hex/Hunter's Mark. At number 9, we'll be going over 2 bonus action debuff spells since they're both pretty good and only available in 1 class each. For Hunter's Mark, it's only available to Rangers, and as a bonus action, you get to apply a debuff to a target you can see within 90 feet, where each time you deal weapon damage to the target, you also deal an additional 1d6 damage. The ability lasts for 1 hour by default, and if the target you use it on dies, you can use a bonus action on your next available turn to just move it to another target, without having to cast the spell again. So Hunter's Mark basically allows Rangers to just have an additional 1d6 damage to all of their attacks, and is so good that the class is kind of balanced around the spell. It also has the niche distinction where you just have an easier time tracking the target if they get away, which really fits into the Ranger archetype. Hex is kind of like Hunter's Mark only for Warlocks, except it's a tiny bit better, because for the same conditions as Hunter's Mark, bonus action, 90-foot range, 1 hour duration, concentration requirement, you get to put a mark on something that allows you to deal an additional 1d6 damage to them each time you do damage to them. But it also allows you to choose 1 ability check for the target to have disadvantage on whenever they do an ability check. Normally, you don't do too many ability checks during combat, except for instances like resolving a grapple, where you have to perform either an athletics or acrobatics check in order to avoid it. So if you use Hex on a creature that you know may have a high strength or dexterity score, you can lower one of those 2 in order to make it easier to grapple them, especially if comboed with something like Bigsby's Hand, that can even allow you to grapple big bosses like adult red dragons. And at number 8, we have Goodberry. This is a spell that only druids and rangers can use, which allows you to produce 10 berries that last for 24 hours, with each one having the effect to restore 1 hit point on consumption, while also providing enough nourishment to sustain a creature for 1 day. So basically, it allows you to heal someone for 10 hit points if you feed them all 10 berries. But it does take 1 action to eat a single berry, so you can't heal someone for 10 hit points during a battle. This is kind of an out-of-battle type heal, with a couple of niche good interactions inside of combat as well. You see, in D&D 5e, there isn't really penalties for coming back at 0 hit points, just as long as you don't die before you get healed. But any amount of healing will bring a player back up, which means 1 hit point is more than enough to get someone back into the battle. They can also be used to round someone off at lower levels, as most players only have around 10 hit points anyway, and to distribute heals amongst the group who might have only taken a light amount of damage. There is also the really big factor that the berries count as food for the entire day, whereas this single-handedly allows you to almost completely circumvent survival games, because 1 cast of Goodberry will be enough to feed your entire party for the day, so there's no need to try to go out and hunt for food. The only thing you need to find is water, and it's this little interaction that makes Goodberry kind of broken. This 1 little first level spell completely negates the need to pay or look for food. And you could even cast Goodberry at the end of the night before your spell slots reset, as the 10 Goodberries last for 24 hours. although there might be some GM approval needed if you want to shove a good berry into someone's mouth when they're unconscious, or if a pet hawk would be able to feed a good berry to someone who is down as well. And at number 7, we have Magic Missile. This is a level 1 damaging spell, and the only pure damaging spell that would be on this list. Because what Magic Missile does is it allows you to do 1d4 plus 1 force damage to one target within 120 feet, plus 2 more darts if cast at its base version at level 1, for a maximum of 15 damage at level 1. And what's interesting to note about Magic Missiles is that the spell does not have an attack roll or a spell save DC. It just automatically hits, and this is kind of big. If you absolutely need damage on something, Magic Missiles is perfect for finishing off a low health target, or someone that's trying to run away. And it's also just decent damage if you're using it to attack things normally too, especially since there's no need to worry about it missing. If you cast at higher levels, you get to add 1 more dart per upcast of the spell. And one little thing to note about Magic Missiles, you only roll the damage once, and then that damage applies to all of the darts you create. Magic Missile is one of the few ways to get guaranteed damage in the game, and it's at a very generous range of 120 feet, and can even be softly considered an AoE, since you can direct all the darts to different targets. They don't need to be on the same target, but they can be on the same target if you want to load them all into one boss. It may not be the highest damage at level 1, but the fact that it never misses and deals the damage type that is one of the least resisted types of damage in the game means you probably do an average of more damage to Magic Missiles over the course of the game than any other first level spells that have an attack roll. And at number 6, we have Fairy Fire. Fairy Fire is an AoE spell which kind of works like a glitter bomb, in that you throw a bunch of light in a 20-foot cube, and everyone inside the cube who fails the dexterity saving throw gets covered in whatever kind of light you choose, as you can pick blue, green, or violet light. And then, while covered in this light, they shed dim light for a 10-foot radius, they can't benefit from being invisible, and all attack rolls against them have advantage. The ability lasts for up to a minute or as long as you keep concentration on it. And it also lasts if they leave the original area, as it kind of works like an AoE Fairy Fire from World of Warcraft. Once you apply the debuffs, it stays on them until it ends or until you end your concentration. And here's what's so good about this. Having advantage on attack rolls basically gives you a 25% increased chance to hit, which is really good. So good, in fact, that it's really hard to grant this kind of bonus to things. And Fairy Fire allows you to grant it to all attacks to multiple targets for basically an entire encounter. This is an absolutely huge buff to the rest of your group if they use attack rolls, which most parties do have a couple of people who rely exclusively on attack rolls. It also has the niche benefit of revealing invisible targets, which is pretty difficult to do at low levels. Although Fairy Fire's reveal is kind of one of the better ones too, as Fairy Fire is one of the few ways to actually see invisible targets who are benefiting from the spell of non-detection, since Fairy Fire isn't a divination spell, where usually non-detection allows invisible targets to be protected from stuff like the True Sight spell. But Fairy Fire gets around that because it's not affected by non-detection. So if you throw Fairy Fire in something and they fail the saving throw, there's almost nothing they can do to stay invisible, which is really good, on top of the really good benefit you get of attack rolls having advantage on them. And at number 5, we have Bless. Bless is the first level buff spell, only available to paladins or clerics, that allows you to choose up to 3 targets in order to give them an extra 1d4 on all their attack rolls and saving throws. So it's both a DPS increase and a defensive boost, as getting an extra 1d4 in your attack rolls is pretty nice. That can amount to as little as a 5% increase to your attack, or as much as a 20% increase. And most saving throws for your appropriate level generally have pretty low DCs to meet, so being able to roll an additional 1d4 on a saving throw is kind of huge at low levels. And at higher levels, it could be the only way to make saving throws against epic level monsters. So really, both of these effects are good, but the saving throw boost is probably the better of the two. Because remember, it works on all saving throws, and technically, a death saving throw counts as a saving throw, so it even works if you go down. The spell does only last for 1 minute and requires concentration, but you get to target 3 people at its base level, so you essentially get to cover half the party. Or the entire party if you have a small group, and casting it at higher levels only increases the amount of people you can target with the effect. So if you cast it at 3rd level, you can target up to 5 people and basically cover the average adventuring group. And at number 4, we have Absorb Elements. This is one of the few reaction spells in the game, which allows you to use a reaction in order to gain resistance to a damage type for a full turn, as long as you use it in reaction to taking acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage. Basically, all the main, most common types of damage besides poison. And of course, radiant, necrotic, or force, because it's rare to get resistances to those 3 types. In addition to giving you resistances for a full round to one type of damage you take, it will also buff your next melee attack by 1d6 damage, based on the type of damage you took. So if you have the Elemental Adapt feat and get hit by the type of damage you chose for that feat, you'll actually be able to throw it back at the attacker while ignoring any resistances they might have to that damage, while also coincidentally being able to treat any 1s on the damage die as a 2. It's not really the best combo in the world, and Absorb Elements' damage component is only useful to creatures that actually attack with melee weapons, but it is an incredibly niche and situational interaction that should work, which doesn't really provide extra damage though. The main use of Absorb Elements is to take half damage from spells, like when getting hit by a dragon's fire breath. You'll definitely want to take half damage from it, or take a fourth of the damage if you succeed the saving throw as well. And at number 3, we have Find Familiar. This is the spell that takes 1 hour to cast, costs 10 gold for one of its components, that allows you to summon a little animal companion to help you for as long as it lives, since it doesn't technically have a duration. So, you can just cast Find Familiar a single time and have it for an entire campaign, assuming it never gets killed in battle. And this is why Find Familiar is one of the best spells to take with the Spell Initiate feat, which gives you a free use of 1 first level spell per day, because you get more mileage out of being able to cast 1 Find Familiar per day than pretty much any other spell. Now, you are limited in what your Familiar can actually do, and you're even limited in which minion you can even pick, where you have a small selection of Familiars listed in the spell. Of course, you can also just pick other creatures assuming your DM allows it, just as long as they fit in with the other restrictions where the Familiar cannot attack, it rolls its own initiative in combat and acts on its own turn, but it can use other actions as normal, and you can cast touch range spells through your Familiar, which can be situationally useful in some circumstances since it uses your attack roll for the Familiars and not its own. It's just kind of hard to position the Familiar when it has its own initiative turn. Here's the thing though, the Familiar can't attack, but it can use other actions, including the ever so important help action. If the help action is used in combat, it allows a creature to distract a foe in a way to give advantage on the next 1 attack roll on one of your allies does to the target before its next turn. So a Familiar can give you free advantage 1 time on 1 creature per round of combat, and because of that, one of the best Familiars to take is the Owl, since it has the impressive 60-foot flying speed and the ever so important flyby trait, which means it can go into melee range to use the help action, since you do need to be within 5 feet of a target to use help, and then just fly away without provoking an attack of opportunity thanks to the flyby ability. So if you want a pure combat Familiar, the Owl is probably one of the best ones you can pick. Not only that, one of the biggest benefits of Find Familiar is the ability to see through the Familiar's senses as if you're physically controlling them. And as long as Familiar is within 100 feet of you, you're able to see and hear everything Familiar is observing, which makes it an excellent scouting tool up to 100 feet away, which is also pretty useful if you use the Owl to just fly in and avoid everything, as the Owl also coincidentally has a +3 to its stealth skill. And it is technically possible to stealth while flying. So, for both being an excellent out-of-combat utility spell, with it being one of the best scouting tools you can use, and being able to help in combat with its flyby help action, Find Familiar is an excellent first level spell, and definitely one of the best ones you can pick up if you only have the ability of picking 1 spell per day with the Magic Initiate feat. Although there are technically 2 other first level spells that are a little bit better if you're able to cast more than 1 spell per day. And at number 2, we have Healing Word. Healing Word is a simple healing spell that heals for 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier as health, and is only available to the Bard, Cleric, and Druid classes. What makes Healing Word one of the best healing spells in the game, though, is the fact that it can be cast as a bonus action and has a range of 60 feet. Nearly all of the other healing spells in the game require your action to use, so being able to heal anything at all with a bonus action allows you to get up a downed ally who's making death saving throws from range, and then attack like normal with your regular action or use a cantrip. Being able to heal on a bonus action with only a first level spell slot is huge, to the point where people kind of call Healing Word overpowered sometimes, because it kind of is. One person with Healing Word can kind of keep an entire party alive through a boss constantly taking them down, while also dealing some damage to the boss as well, because as long as you're not dead, any amount of healing will bring you back and into the fight. So if that healing can be done at range with a bonus action, it's even better, because a lot of the healing spells also require melee range to do things, including the other first level healing spell, Not only is it the only low-level healing spell that allows you to use a bonus action to cast it, it's also the only low-level ranged one as well, which is why it easily takes a high spot on this list. And at number 1, we have Shield. This is another one of the few reaction spells in the game. This one allows you to put a shield on yourself, which automatically blocks the magic missile spell, and also gives you an impressive +5 to your AC until the start of your next turn. A +5 to AC is huge. That's enough to cause a lot of attacks to miss where they otherwise would have hit, or to just make you unhittable from certain creatures if you have a high enough AC and use the ability. Because not only does it provide a really nice +5 AC bonus to the triggering attack, it also just lasts for an entire round afterwards. An entire round of a +5 to AC is kind of broken, and there's a reason the spell doesn't scale any higher. If you upcast a shield spell, it only ever gives it +5 to AC, because a +5 to AC is already really big. That's like temporarily equipping a +3 legendary shield. If you're a DM and you want to make one of your monsters ridiculously hard to deal with, just allow them to cast shield as a reaction, and your players will hate you for not being able to ever hit your creature. Or if you give a ring of spell storing to a melee fighter, and it only has 5 copies of the shield spell stored in it, then you just increase the survivability by a pretty hefty amount. Shield is one of those spells that is really good if you're able to cast it multiple times, kind of like Healing Word. It's not the best spell if you're only able to use one first level spell per day, but if you have multiple first level spell slots like most casters do, then Shield is kind of one of the must-have picks, as it gives you more survivability than almost anything else, unless you know for certain you're going against a lot of magic damage that's not magic missiles or attack base, in which case Absorb Elements is probably better. But most creatures deal attack rolls as damage, so Shield is vastly more useful against the majority of the monster manual, which is why it takes the number 1 spot of this list, assuming you're able to cast multiple of them per day. Being able to use a single shield spell per day isn't as good as being able to use a single Find Familiar. In this video, we'll be going over some of the best spells you can pick up with a 2nd level spell slot, either for its utility use, but sometimes because of its damage potential. And at number 10, we have Lesser Restoration. What this spell does is pretty simple. By touching a creature, you can end one disease or one condition affecting them. If you choose a condition, it can be the blinded, deafened, paralyzed, or poison condition. This spell is open to most spellcasters, at least the support types, and is very useful for any support, simply because it can be common for someone to get at least one of these conditions, and most of these can be quite troublesome, especially ones that last a long time or could maybe even kill you, like being affected by a gas spore's Death Burst ability. A fun thing to note is that if you have a party that is a bit too adventurous, this spell can be used to remove STDs or cure drunkenness, in case your party dwarf or bard makes some bad decisions. And at number 9, we have Heat Metal. How this spell works is when casting the spell, you choose a metal object and then heat it up. Now, RP-wise, this could be anything, so if your DM lets you, you could use this to boil water in a pot with no fire. But its main use is to choose a set of medium armor, a heavy armor, or a weapon that is made of metal. The metal then begins to heat up, and any creature in physical contact with that metal takes 2d8 fire damage when you first cast the spell. So if they are holding a weapon or wearing armor, they will take that damage. After that, you can use a bonus action each turn to do that damage again, until of course the minute ends or your concentration breaks. The creature wearing or holding the metal object takes the damage no matter what, and if it can drop the item, it automatically drops it, unless they succeed a Constitution saving throw. They can keep holding the item, but until the start of the caster's next turn, they have disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks while holding that heated metal, which basically means they ain't hitting nobody with that weapon unless they get really lucky. So if you're fighting someone who's wielding a powerful weapon or some sort of metal object you want to take, you can force them to drop it using this, and then grab it and run, among other things. But the biggest use is casting this on enemies who are wearing metal armor, as removing medium and heavy armor takes quite a while. There is no chance the enemy can get rid of this damage, so their only hope is to interrupt your spellcasting. And since you can reactivate it every turn as a bonus action, you can simply cast Heat Metal, stand back, and every turn use your normal action for something else. Then reactivate it for even more damage, cooking your enemies alive. As long as you can keep a distance, you can easily make yourself a cooked foe. And at number 8, we have Zone of Truth. Lack someone with really good insight? Have someone need to question who you don't trust to not swindle you with their expertise in lying? Well, Zone of Truth is the spell for you. With a range of 60 feet, a duration of 10 minutes, when you cast a spell, you create a 15-foot radius spear on a point of your choice within range. Until the spell ends, a creature that enters the spell for the first time on a turn, or starts its turn there, needs to make a charisma saving throw. Upon failing the save, the creature can't speak a deliberate lie while in the circle, and the caster of the circle knows if an enemy fails or succeeds the saving throw. So absolutely no way for the person you're questioning to sneak their way out. A creature affected by the spell knows the spell is affecting them, and thus can choose to avoid answering questions if it would normally respond with a lie. And so a creature can try to be evasive in answering questions as long as it's in the radius. This spell does not force people to speak, but it does force them to tell the truth. This spell is amazing for interrogations and questionings, to make sure someone is telling the truth without having to rely on those pesky insight rolls, which might not even tell you if they're lying or not, since by rules as written, insight is not a lie detector. But lots of tables homebrew it to be one. This spell is actually a lie detector though, or at least a truth maker. Just remember, if you're trying to interrogate, to not step into the zone yourself. Otherwise, you won't be able to lie either. Although, I guess you could use it as a way to prove yourself truthful to someone, or even trick them if you succeed the check and they won't know that you can lie. And at number 7, we have locate animals or plants and locate object. While there's also a locate creature spell, this spell is a 4th level, so we won't be talking about that. Anyways, these two spells both generally do the same thing, but have overall very different effects. Both of them locate a specific thing within a large radius. First, we go over locate object. This spell has you describe or name an object you're familiar with, meaning you were within 30 feet of it at least once and could see it, and for the duration, you can sense the direction of that object, as long as it's within 1,000 feet of you. And if it is moving, you know the direction it's moving. I'm sure you could see how this could be useful. As a thief just ran off with your coin purse, target your coin purse and give chase. Your wizard been kidnapped, target his spellbook, and you are sure to find where he's being held. You can also specify things of specific kinds. Say, the nearest jeweled necklace, or a closest bit of a specific furniture, tool, or weapon. You can even use this to track down hidden artifacts or lost treasures. Locate animals or plants works pretty much the same. However, it only allows you to specify a specific species of beast or plant. This allows you to learn the direction and distance to the nearest target of that kind within 5 miles. This can be quite useful overall in many circumstances. Need to find one rare kind of creature or plant for a quest, or is being hidden, low on food and need to find a nearby pack of deer to hunt. Maybe you're trying to save a sick NPC or create a special potion and need to find a rare herb. Well, what if you're walking through the woods and want to make sure there's no bears, wolves, or other feral beasts nearby? All of that is a great use for this spell, especially since it can be ritual cast, meaning if you have the time, you can use it again and again as needed without a spell slot, simply at the cost of 10 minutes. And at number 6, we have Crown of Madness. When you cast this spell, you can choose a humanoid within range, and they must make a wisdom saving throw or become charmed for the duration. It is very obvious that they are being controlled as their eyes change color and jagged iron crowns appear on their head, so you can't really use this secretly. The charmed creature must use its action to make a melee attack on a creature of your choice each turn, or be unable to move until after it attacks. And the creature can act on its own if you choose no creature, or if there's no creatures in its range. On each turn after the first turn, you must use your action to keep control, or the spell instantly ends. However, the target can also take a wisdom save every turn to try and end the effect early. Now, an interesting thing to note, unlike a lot of other charm effects, it does not break or activate a save on taking damage. Meaning, this ability is good for one major thing, controlling enemies to attack other enemies. This spell can be very powerful when used against powerful melee enemies with low wisdom, because it simultaneously does two powerful things. 1, it removes an enemy from the fight, and 2, gives you potentially extra damage for the battle if used on a big target. In card games, the ability to take control of your opponent's cards, even temporarily, is very powerful, and it's just as good in D&D as well. That's why probably the biggest limiting factor to this ability is that it only works on humanoid targets. And at number 5, we have the Immovable Object spell. This spell is from the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount and is for Chronergy wizards, but can be used by any spellcaster with a DM's approval. So just keep that in mind before we go into this. Everybody likes the Immovable Rod, but how about we turn any and every item into one? Holding an object that weighs no more than 10 pounds, you can cause it to become magically stuck in place, and you and any creatures you designate can move the object normally, or you could even set a password that suppresses the spell's effect for 1 minute if spoken within 5 feet. While fixated in the air, the item can hold up to 4,000 pounds of weight, falling if there's more. And a creature can make a strength check against your spell save DC to try to move it, allowing them to move it up to 10 feet on a success. So now, what are some uses for this? Well, let's go over a few. Placing an item behind a door to act as a doorstop is a pretty simple application. However, a thing to note about this spell is a lack of a saving throw, attack roll, or restriction on worn or carried items. So, if you're in melee range of an enemy, you can basically cast this on any items of theirs that you can touch that is less than 10 pounds to basically force them to abandon that object. Usually, most armor is too heavy to target except for 2 of them, and something as light as a shirt can be taken off easily. But you can target almost all weapons, shoes, a light t-shirt, or leather and padded armor, as both are 10 pounds or lighter. And only a handful of weapons weigh more than 10 pounds. So unless they have a pike or a heavy crossbow, everything else is a viable target. Also, remember, there's no concentration or rolls involved to do this, so it's pretty situational targeted control. Or something else fun to mention, do you find yourself in a large valley that you need to cross? A roll of cloth can be attached to an arrow like a rope and fired across a large gap. Then you can cast a spell on it. Even though it's very long and wide, you can still make the cloth into a path that can hold 4,000 pounds. That way you can shimmy across. Although this might be stretching the limits of the spell a bit. Do you want to keep someone from getting away? Put something on them like a pair of manacles and then cast a spell on that. Or the more evil route, get a small object like a pebble, cast a spell on it, then speak the command word so it temporarily loses the huge amount of weight, and then force feed it to a person, wait 5 minutes, and suddenly they're stuck for the remaining 55 minutes. Any movement would press against them from the inside. This spell's limits are basically just your imagination, and made even more powerful when you cast it at higher levels, which can make it heavier or even a permanent cast if used with a 6th level or higher spell slot. The only real downside to this spell is the 25 gold cost per use, which could be insignificant or a deal breaker based on your campaign. There's a reason this spell says in its spell description that it requires your DM's approval to even take it, because there seems to be a few oversights with how useful it can be with just its rules as written. And at number 4, we have Pass Without Trace. We all know those issues of a group stealth checks trying to sneak by guards or ambush a bandit camp, but the danged fighter in any of their heavy armor or the ranger in their scale mail have disadvantage on their stealth checks, as the clapping of their AC alerts the guards. So how do you counter that? Well, by casting Pass Without Trace. Lasting for up to an hour with concentration, it creates a veil of shadows that causes silence to radiate from you, masking you and each creature you choose within 30 feet of you, concealing yourself, of course, to gain a +10 to their stealth dexterity checks, while also making you and your allies immune to being tracked, except by magical means. No tracks to track or traces to trace. As mentioned before, this is a great way to get through a group stealth check, even if your party is full of people with low dexterity and horribly loud armor and gear because of how great a +10 is, even if they have disadvantage on those stealth checks. It's also a great way to divert people from trying to track you, again, as long as they don't have a way to magically track you. But with how useful stealth is in most settings and games, this is definitely an A-tier spell to pick up, or for at least one person in your party to have. And at number 3, we have Prayer of Healing. This spell is rather simple, 10-minute cast time, 30-foot range, and is usable by clerics and paladins. Because of its 10-minute cast time, this is something you almost never want to use in combat. However, its effects are far too good to pass up, being by far the most efficient healing spell for its level. And how so? Well, it heals up to 6 creatures of your choice that you can see within range, and each creature heals for 2d8 plus your spellcasting modifier. The only downside being is it does not work on undeads or constructs. But let's compare it to a spell like Cure Wounds, a 1st level spell that heals. This ability heals 1 creature that is not undead or construct for 1d8 plus your spell mod. So at the cost of a 1 higher level spell slot and a 10-minute cast time, you now heal not only up to 6 times more targets, you now also heal them for 2d8 plus spell mod instead of 1d8 plus spell mod. Of course, Cure Wounds is still good for its instant healing. The simple, raw healing energy of Prayer of Healing is undeniable. And as long as you have the time after combat, you can quickly give your entire party a health boost countered by no other spell for a fair few levels. You can even increase a level of healing by 1d8 for each spell slot level used. Again, for example, maxed out at a bonus of 6d8 worth of healing, compared to something like Cure Wounds at higher levels only increasing by 1d8 each level as well. Of course, how much a first level spell slot is worth compared to a second level is debatable, but rarely can one dish out 10 times more healing with a single spell slot increase. And at number 2, we have Silence. This spell is super simple. First off, it's a ritual, so you can cast it as you wish, when you wish, simply at the cost of 10 minutes of your time, or as one action if you want to cast it instantly at the cost of a spell slot. This spell has one simple effect. It creates a 20-foot radius sphere of absolute silence. But what this accomplishes is a few things, so let's go over it. First off, no sound can be created within the 20-foot radius sphere, and no sound can pass through it. Any creature or object fully in the area is immune to thunder damage, any creature inside is treated as deafened, and lastly, anyone within the radius cannot cast spells that require a verbal component. So what are the uses for this? Well, the coolest use is you can cast onto a group of enemy spellcasters, forcing them to stop casting since a vast majority of spells require a verbal component to cast. And if they simply don't have the movement to get out of the radius that turn, do not have non-verbal spells, or are trapped inside of a room, they are left to do literally nothing other than panic because they can't use most of their spells. And they can't even call out to their allies to target the person channeling the silent spell. Another use is in case you need to do something very loud and don't want to alert literally everyone in the vicinity. And another example would be fighting an enemy who uses mostly thunder-based attacks. And while it limits what you and your party can do, making you and everyone in a 20-foot radius immune to enemies' major damage type can be quite powerful for a second level spell. And again, this spell can be cast as a ritual, so you can save a spell slot by performing a ritual version of the silence to do these things, as long as you have the spare time to do it before combat. Casting silence onto a group of bandits all around a fire as an opening move of an ambush is a pretty amazing way to start a panic. Those bandits won't be able to communicate, and won't be able to understand what the heck is happening or hear the rogue rushing them from behind even. And as an honorable mention, Healing Spirit. This one could have easily have been number 1 and been far above every other spell on this list. But this spell was nerfed, as its original version summoned a spirit that could last for up to a minute and healed anyone who stepped into it. So, a full party could just take turns hopping in and out of the spirit for a full minute to heal rather easily out of combat, with only a second level spell slot. However, it was errata to only be able to heal a specific amount of times instead of an unlimited amount, being 1 plus your spellcasting modifier. This changed the spell from being quite possibly the most broken spell in the game to a rather meh healing spell. And at number 1, we have Spike Growth. Spike Growth is a spell with a couple of parts. First being you select a point within range that creates a 20-foot radius of hard spikes and thorns. That circle of area becomes difficult terrain for the duration of the spell, having speed through the area. And when a creature enters the area, or while within it, they take 2d4 piercing damage for every 5 feet they travel. So to get from one side to the other, a creature would take 16d4 worth of piercing damage. However, the transformation of the ground looks natural, meaning it will not look out of the ordinary, be it a moss or vines or a bit of bristle. Which means that a creature that did not see the spell being cast must make a wisdom perception check against your spell save DC to recognize the terrain as dangerous. Even if they succeed the save, they still get hurt going through it. They just know ahead of time that they will get hurt. If they don't succeed, they might start running into it and quickly realize how hazardous it is. But just remember, a creature can stop its movement at any point during their turn. So they can just choose to stop as soon as they take damage and not run headlong through the full area of effect. There are a fair few ways the spell can be used. First off, the fact that it makes a 40 by 40 area into difficult terrain for up to 10 minutes is rather good on its own. But the fact that it also does 2d4 damage automatically with no saving throws for every 5 feet traveled can be very powerful. See, 4 castle guards you need to take out, place this between you and them, or even directly on them. They now need to take 2d4 damage for every space they move, and at half movement speed. Or if you're being chased through a hallway or corridor, or some sort of area you can funnel enemies through, you can put this spell behind you, slowing or even killing those chasing after you. The best part is, if an enemy does not succeed the check or see you cast the spell, they will run 5 feet in, realize that they're hurt, and then run 5 feet out, taking 4d4 damage, and also having moved 20 feet of their movement for that turn because of the difficult terrain. And since it lasts for up to 10 minutes, it can do an insane amount of damage overall, acting as a killing floor of damage of difficult terrain for entire armies. This is the spell to use if you want to completely stop the movement of enemy minions, if it doesn't just outright kill them when they move. A spell that does a fair bit of damage on its own is strong, but not the best. One that has utility can be situationally useful, but are usually somewhat niche. But the best spells are the ones that can do both. And this is why Spike Growth is at number 1. Characters normally get 3rd level spells at level 5, and it's one of the biggest power increases that spellcasters get, because of just how good pretty much all of the 70 plus 3rd level spells are. So in this list we'll be going over the 10 best of them, generally based on how useful they are. And at number 10 we have Spirit Guardians. This is a spell which can only be learned by clerics, or classes that can steal cleric spells, which basically creates a 15-foot radius area effect for 10 minutes, which deals 3d8 damage to enemies and cuts their movement speed in half, and allows you to designate allies to be immune to its effects. There are very few AoEs that allow you to not damage allies, so this is always a big plus to mention. And the spell damages enemies the first time they enter it on a turn, or if they start their turn inside of its radius. However, a distinction to be made is that it only deals damage if they enter it, and not if you move the effect to them. Now, what makes this spell good is the fact that it's able to do a lot of long-term AoE damage, as if you're able to get the damage 2 times to an enemy target, then that's equivalent of hitting them with a single fireball in damage, which is kind of the max when it comes to damage at this level from a spell. Although, there are a lot of downsides to Spirit Guardians. The biggest one is definitely the concentration factor. You have to concentrate on the spell, and it has a short 15-foot radius. So, the power of the spell is in its longevity, and if you just get attacked by creatures and drop Spirit Guardians before you're able to deal its damage twice, then it's kind of a lackluster 3rd level spell. And since you have to be so close in order for it to work, there's a good chance you'll have lots of enemies in range attacking you in order to try to make you perform concentration checks. So unless you're just really geared out into making Spirit Guardians as useful as possible, like taking Warcaster or Resilient Constitution, or if your DM is just nice and doesn't attack your character, then it's going to be hard to actually keep Spirit Guardians up for more than a turn, against a group of enemies. Although, the potential damage of this thing is really good, because you cast it once and you basically have a passive AoE, which is going to be dealing damage for the entire encounter, assuming everything in rage doesn't break your concentration, of course. Which means you can also cast other spells on your subsequent turns, while still gaining the advantage of Spirit Guardians that you cast on turn 1. And the speed decrease from the ability stacks with difficult terrain, as it simply cuts their speed in half. So, it's a pretty good 3rd level spell, and a lot of people take it as a priority if they're playing clerics, because of just how much damage it can potentially do over the course of an entire combat encounter. Although in my experience, combat encounters don't usually last long enough for Spirit Guardians to deal massive amounts of damage, and unless your DM is really nice about creature placements, they're probably not going to end their turns close to a cleric using this ability. So it takes a lot of position in order to get the full effect out of it. But it's one of those effects which is kind of worth trying to get the full effect out of it. And at number 9, we have the Fly spell. This spell simply gives a creature you touch a fly speed of 60 feet for the duration of the spell, which is 10 minutes. And if you upcast the spell, you can target more people, so you can potentially have your entire party flying with the spell, which is sometimes a necessity. You see, fly speed in D&D is actually super valuable, as being able to fly out of combat allows you to break a whole bunch of encounters, and being able to fly in combat has a lot of benefits as well. Although that kind of brings up the downside to fly, and why it's only the number 9 spot on this list. The Fly spell requires your concentration. So, if you're using it in combat and get attacked while you're in the air, there's a chance you'll lose concentration and just fall out of the sky. Although there are some enemies which straight up do not have ranged attacks, like most beasts and, funny enough, the 5e Tarrasque. So, using the Fly spell is tantamount to being immune to damage from those creatures, which is a pretty strong thing to gain from a 3rd level spell, seeing as the ability to become immune to damage is actually the function of a 9th level spell. And since fly speed is so useful, having a spell that just allows you to do it is just also very useful, which is why the Fly spell has to take one of the spots at the top 10. Even if it's not the most useful thing in combat, flying is usually very useful outside of combat, where the concentration requirement doesn't matter as much. A few examples could be, if you're in a dungeon and there's a whole bunch of spikes on the floor or just traps, you can just fly above the ground in order to guarantee you don't trigger anything. If there's a broken bridge, you can just fly to the other side or slowly carry everyone else across, or carry over rope in order to create a makeshift bridge. If you're being chased by someone, you can just fly on top of a building, and unless they can fly too, there's not much they can reasonably do to climb and chase after you fast enough. Or if you're out in a big opening and you're just being attacked by a whole bunch of things and you need to run away, you can just fly out of there and leave all your party members behind, because as soon as you get 60 feet into the air, that kind of outranges a lot of thrown weapons, where they can only hit you if they have bows or long-range spells. A lot of the official modules are not balanced around flying either, and it allows you to trivialize a lot of encounters. There's also the fact that it just gives you a higher speed than normal, so it's incredibly useful to be able to fly, and definitely worth the spell slot if you don't have flying in some other way, like through a racial or magic item, especially since you can grant this effect to other party members and not just yourself. And at number 8, we have Lv9's Tiny Hut. This is a spell with a 1-minute cast time, which allows you to create a 10-foot radius dome, which allows you to house yourself and up to 9 other party members, just as long as their size is medium or smaller, which all player characters are since there isn't an official race which allows you to become a large creature. This spell lasts for 8 hours and doesn't require concentration. It makes it so creatures outside the area that you didn't designate are not allowed to come inside the barrier, nor can they attack or use spells on anyone inside the barrier. Although technically a dragon's breath is not considered an attack or spell, so they can definitely fry you while you're trying to hide inside a tiny hut. Although pretty much everything else is basically just not going to be able to attack you while you're inside the hut. And while you're inside the hut, you're not allowed to use spells on anyone outside the hut either, but you are allowed to move objects through it, which means if you have a bow and arrow, you're able to shoot creatures from outside the hut without fear of retaliation. Although, since the hut has a 1-minute cast time, this isn't really something you can do mid-combat in order to become immune to damage while you attack things with a bow. It's kind of something that requires a lot of setup beforehand. Or just one that happens if you're attacked while trying to take a long rest, which is the main benefit of Lv9's Tiny Hut. Generally, just use this thing before you take a long rest, if you're in a dangerous area like the middle of the wilderness, inside a dungeon, or one of the 9 layers of hell. You lay down Lv9's Tiny Hut, and then can comfortably long rest for 8 hours. Be able to see outside the hut, since it's completely transparent to you, and if there are creatures outside, you won't have to deal with them until the spell ends. Or unless one of the creatures outside has a way to dispel the hut, although very few creatures in the monster manual have the ability to cast Dispel magic, so you're fine for the most part unless you long rest near Yunagu. And at number 7, we have Mass Healing Word. This is a spell that can only be used by bards or clerics, and as a bonus action allows you to cast Healing Word on up to 6 targets within 60 feet. And Healing Word is an absolutely amazing first level spell, because it basically allows you to heal a target at range with a bonus action. And Mass Healing Word is just the evolved version of that. Although there are a couple of problems with Mass Healing Word when compared to just its first level counterpart. Generally, the best use of Healing Word is to use it on a downed party member that's unconscious but not yet dead, as it will bring them back into the combat. Mass Healing Word requires a much higher level spell slot, and is generally not worth using over the first level spell slot unless you have multiple party members down, as just using the ability to heal a party member who's low on health isn't really worth it because it doesn't heal enough where it's really that impactful, as it's only 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier. So if you have a modifier of +5 and you roll a maximum of a d4 on that roll, then you're only healing everyone for 9 hit points. So the best use of the ability is definitely to yo-yo heal a lot of downed party members, or just provide healing to everyone while trying to get up a downed party member. And since it's also a bonus action which heals multiple people, it's a pretty valuable heal. In a campaign I ran, I had one of my enemy characters with Mass Healing Word, and it made the fight way more deadly than it probably should have been, because that one character kept just bringing all of their allies back into the battle with yo-yo healing. That was until my players got brutal and just started killing all the down characters. In 5e, there isn't an official penalty for just going unconscious and then coming back with just any amount of healing. So, Mass Healing Word is just a really good way to make use of that. As if multiple party members go down, you don't have to pick one of them in order to bring back into the battle. Assuming you have a 3rd level spell slot available, of course. And at number 6, we have Lightning Bolt. This is a pure blasting spell that deals 86 lightning damage to all targets in a 100-foot line. And this is tied for the most amount of damage that a spell can do at the 3rd level. And in fact, it's so good that it kind of beats out a lot of 4th and 5th level spells in damage as well. There's only one other 3rd level spell in the game which comes close to it in damage, besides the one that's tied with it in damage, and that's Lightning Arrow, which is basically a single target spell. So Lightning Bolt AoE damage can beat out Lightning Arrow's single target potential, although that's a baseline Lightning Arrow not counted in any modifiers, but you get the point. Lightning Bolt is a massive damage dealing ability. Although since it only goes in a straight line, it is kind of hard to hit all of your enemy targets with it, or to even hit a couple of them. So it's not as valuable as the other spells which can also deal the same amount of damage at this level, which I'll be talking about a little bit later on this list. However, since it is in a line, it's a lot easier to maneuver than some of the more AoE focused spells without worrying about hitting your party members. And also, since it does hit really hard, you could give it to one of your NPCs if you're a GM, if you want one of your NPCs to have a very dangerous spell to have, but not something which can wipe out the entire party too easily either. And at number 5, we have Hypnotic Pattern. This is a control spell which can target creatures in a 30-foot cube, where if all of those creatures fail their wisdom save, they become charmed, incapacitated, and their speed is reduced to 0. And then they just kind of stay like this for the full duration of the spell, which is 1 minute. Now, what makes this better than a lot of the other control spells at lower levels, or even at this level, is that there's no other saves past the first one. Usually, when a spell will control someone for multiple rounds, it allows the target to perform an additional save at the end of each of their rounds, but not Hypnotic Pattern. If they fail once, then they have the potential to be controlled for a full minute. And the only other way to break Hypnotic Pattern is if the creature takes any damage, another creature uses an action in order to shake them awake, or if you drop your concentration. So with the big 30-foot cube the Hypnotic Pattern takes up, it is possible to just completely disable an entire enemy team, which can allow your teammates to better position themselves in order to just blast them in order to break the effect, or just get past them if they don't want to take the lethal option. However, if you don't hit everyone with it, it's easy for some DMs to just metagame the spell, and they'll have an NPC party member immediately try to shake away everyone else under Hypnotic Pattern to end it quicker. Although, even that requires a full action by the creature per person, so it's still wasting other creatures' turns in order to accomplish this feat. Hypnotic Pattern is just a beast of a control ability, which is even usable at higher levels of play, as the effect is pretty much good in all tiers. So it's just a good spell to pick up if you need an emergency control an entire group of enemies. Or if you accidentally hit one of your party members, you can just gently shake them awake with an action so they can get back into the battle. And at number 4, we have Revivify. This is a spell which costs 300 gold to cast each time you use it, which basically allows you to bring one creature back to life, just as long as they died within the last minute. The creature brought back will only have 1 hit point, and it doesn't work on any creature which died of old age, nor does it restore any missing body parts. Although the best use of Revivify is using it immediately after combat is over in order to bring someone back to life, who maybe was unfortunate and died and failed their death saving throws mid-combat, which is something that comes up pretty often in the average game. And just having someone in your party with a Revivify spell just puts a lot of other party members more at ease, as they know they probably won't permanently lose their character due to a few unlucky rolls, or just taken out in a combat encounter they weren't expecting to be so difficult. It's also a useful spell if you just need to keep an important NPC alive, as the ability to bring someone back to life has pretty much been useful in every single game that I've ever ran. Although, since the ability is basically a failsafe from a failure state, it only exists in case things actually go wrong. So if nothing ever goes wrong in any of your campaigns, then you'll never use the ability. So it could end up being a wasted use of a spell that you know. Although, generally, the ability to bring things back to life is general enough, where it's worth having something like Revivify in order to rectify that situation, and you're probably better off if you never have to use it anyway. And at number 3, we have Counterspell. This ability is pretty simple. Using your reaction, when you see another creature within 60 feet of you casting a spell, you can stop that spell from being cast, and fail without having any effect. So when an enemy is trying to teleport away, you can use Counterspell in order to stop that. However, if they're using a spell of a higher level than 3rd level, then you have to perform an ability check in order to make sure your Counterspell succeeds, or upcast Counterspell at a higher level in order to make sure it succeeds. Because Counterspell just allows you to stop spells from happening, it's generally used in all tiers of play, and is regularly used in high-level games as well, even though it's a 3rd level spell. The ability to just be able to counter a spell is just very good, even if there aren't a lot of monsters in the monster manual that can actually cast spells. And it doesn't work on innate spellcasting. Although, funny thing to note with Counterspell is that you can counterspell a counterspell. So if there's enough mages in a room, you might have to go through a full chain of negates before you're able to find someone who's successful in casting a spell. As you can also counterspell a counterspell if an enemy caster is trying to counterspell your spell, since it's just a reaction spell and doesn't actually mess with any of the rules for how you cast your spell on a turn, or the rules of using a bonus action while casting a spell, just as long as you have a free hand in order to perform the somatic component of the spell. and that the other spell you're casting doesn't require both of your hands for whatever reason. And at number 2, we have Conjure Animals. This is a spell that basically allows you to summon a bunch of animals to fight for you for up to an hour, or until you lose concentration. And the way you conjure animals is kind of up to you, as you can choose either 1 CR2 beast, 2 CR1 beast, 4 CR1 half beast, or 8 CR1 quarter beast. And how this ability works as rules as written is the person who uses the ability gets to choose which of the 4 options they want to summon. And then it's up to the DM to determine which creatures are actually summoned through the ability. As unless a spell specifically states that you're allowed to pick specific creatures, then it defaults to the official rules, which is just for the DM to pick for you. Because if you're able to summon 8 giant poisonous snakes, then you're able to deal around 125 damage on average with all those snakes, which is equivalent to how much damage a CR20 creature is able to deal in one turn. So you have the potential to just deal way more damage than any other spell possibly can at this level, to a single target anyway. A lot of the AoE spells can technically deal more damage if they just hit more targets. And there's also the fact your DM might not give you 8 giant poisonous snakes. They might give you something else, like 8 wolves or 8 giant badgers, for example. And both of those are pretty good options too. Basically, no matter which beast your DM picks for you, you're going to be doing a ton of damage with the spell, to the point where it's kind of overpowered. You do have to roll for all the creatures in initiative, so they don't get to all go immediately after your turn like a lot of the other summon spells, which is one of the big problems with the ability. If one player uses Conjure Animals, then half of the combat is going to just be all those animals attacking things, which can significantly slow down an encounter. Or speed it up since you'll be doing so much damage with all the summoned creatures that you'll probably kill whatever you're fighting pretty quickly. The other problem with the ability is its concentration requirement, where it's pretty easy for a DM to counter this ability by just targeting the person who controls the animals. That way they drop concentration and all the animals disappear. And while the best way to use this spell is to summon a whole bunch of CR 1/4 creatures, you could make this significantly easier to control by just using one of the higher CR options, even if you don't have the action economy with just a single CR2 creature or 2 CR1 beasts, for example. Although if you allow the player to choose which beast they summon, this ability is one of the strongest spells in the game, until you get to high tiers of play where the beast you summon just won't be able to hit the armor class of higher level creatures, or most of them will just be immune to the beast's damage, unless you're a shepherd druid. And at number 1, we have Fireball. This is a spell with a 150-foot range that deals 8d6 damage to all targets within a 20-foot radius, which is the same damage as a lightning bolt. And as we went over in the lightning bolt section, 8d6 damage is the most amount of damage at this spell level, and higher than a lot of damages from the 4th and 5th level spells as well. And Fireball is kind of the reason why a spellcaster pops off when they hit level 5, and that's because Fireball allows you to basically instantly win encounters by itself. Hypnotic Pattern does allow you to control a whole bunch of creatures in a 30-foot cube, although the best way to control creatures is just to kill them, and Fireball's radius is even bigger. Fireball has an absolutely ridiculous range and radius. You can hit something from further away with a Fireball than you can with the 100-foot line of Lightning Bolt, and potentially just hit more targets. And part of the reason Fireball is above something as overpowered as Conjured Animals is because you can just as easily get rid of an entire group of enemies with just a single Fireball as you could by summoning a whole bunch of giant poisonous snakes, and with a quarter amount of the time and effort too. In fact, you could probably do it way more easily too, as simply hitting 5 creatures with Fireball deals more potential damage than 8 giant poisonous snakes in a round, and you're more likely to actually deal damage to all 5 of those targets than with each of those 8 giant poisonous snakes having to land one of their attacks. Although in a single target scenario, Conjured Animals wins hands down. But D&D combat generally has more than one target to fight, so it's most likely to be more usable in more situations, even if the ridiculously large radius is kind of unruly when trying to not hit your party members as well. Now, there is a pretty big downside to Fireball, and the fact that it deals fire damage, and there are a lot of creatures in the game who resist or are just immune to fire damage. So there are some campaigns in which his damage is probably useless, like Descent into Avernus. Although if the damage of Fireball is working just fine, then it's a no-brainer blaster spell which will probably solve most of your problems. 3rd level spells are some of the most useful spells that most players gain access to, as a lot of games take place at around the level where you obtain 3rd level spell slots. So I thought it's best to go over some of the more best spells you can take, which might be considered the numbers 20 through 11 spots after the first original video. And at number 10, we have Pulse Wave. This is a spell from Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, so you might not be able to take it unless your DM gives you permission to actually use the spell, And basically what it does is allow you to push or pull a whole bunch of creatures within a 30-foot cone, dealing around 66 force damage to each of them. Now, the damage of Pulse Wave isn't super impressive. In fact, it's about 7 less damage on average per target than what Fireball does. But it does have the very useful application of allowing you to push a whole bunch of things off of a cliff. Or if one of your party members sets up some hazardous terrain, it's a super useful way of controlling enemies because it allows you to push or pull, whereas most spells that allow you to do either of those things don't allow you to pick one or the other. So if you have enemies on the other side of a cliff, you can pull them towards you so they fall off. Or if they're right on the edge of the cliff, obviously being able to push them into it is just as useful. If someone sets up the Firewall spell, Pulse Wave can be a great way to push them in and out of the firewall for extra damage, in addition to the force damage it deals, which is pretty decent. Pulse Wave is definitely a combo spell, and not really something you use on its own for its own merits, which is why it's only the number 10 spot on this list. It also has a Constitution saving throw, which is usually pretty bad against monsters from the monster manual, as that's usually the best stat that most of them have. And at number 9, we have Sleet Storm. This spell has the effect where you summon a freezing rain of sleet in a 40-foot radius, 20-foot tall cylinder at a point you can see within 150 feet of you. The effect lasts for a minute as long as you concentrate on it, and the area inside the sleet storm is considered heavily obscured, as well as dousing any flames that are in the area. The ground is also covered with ice, making it difficult terrain, and if a creature starts to turn in the area or enters it, they have to make a dexterity saving throw or else fall prone. It also has some extra effects of forcing concentration checks, but basically what Sleet Storm does is it just creates a huge area of cover, which makes it one of the ultimate running away tools. If a group of enemy orcs is advancing on you, you can just drop a Sleet Storm on them and run away, because the area of the Sleet Storm is gigantic, and it blocks line of sight so they can't shoot arrows through it, unless they physically go through the Sleet Storm and get to the other side, since the area it creates is considered heavily obscured. Or I guess they can shoot through it, it's just they'll be doing it at disadvantage since they're considered blinded through the heavily obscured. And if creatures do try to go through the Sleet Storm, they have a chance at falling prone before they can make it through, in addition to moving at half speed because it's difficult terrain. And remember, you need to spend half your movement in order to get up from the prone condition, which means if they fall prone a single time, there's a good chance they won't be able to physically go through a Sleet Storm before the minute duration is up. And its effects on concentration are a little bit better than just forcing a normal Constitution saving throw. Because if the creature starts its turn inside the Sleet Storm while concentrating on a spell, they have to succeed a Constitution saving throw against your spell save DC, or else they lose the concentration. Whereas normally they only have a DC of 10. So if you have a spell save DC of something like 15, it might actually be enough to end their spells. And since even spellcasters will have a hard time getting out of it, Sleet Storm might be a better spell if you're trying to counter a group of spellcasters than even counterspell, because you'll be forcing harder than normal concentration checks on them, and a lot of the good spells require concentration, including Sleet Storm itself. Although definitely the main benefits of Sleet Storm is just running away. It's kind of better at this job than all the other wall spells that are of the 3rd level range as well. Although, since its radius is so gigantic, and it does affect allies as well, you do have to be careful about where you position it, and it might not be useful at all if you're just in really small areas, where your entire party might be forced to undergo its effects. But when it comes to controlling the largest amount of area with a decent effect, I think Sleet Storm is probably the best, even if plant growth technically can cover a larger range. Sleet Storm covers the 2nd largest range, which doesn't require there to be actual plants nearby to use. You can just use Sleet Storm kind of wherever you want, just as long as you have the spell slot available. At number 8, we have Enemies Abound. This is a single target fear spell, which allows you to target one creature within 120 feet of you that you can see, and force them to make an intelligence saving throw. If they fail, they treat all creatures it can see as enemies until the spell ends. And during that creature's turn, if it tries to attack something or use one of its abilities, it has to choose a random target amongst the creatures that it can see within range for that ability. And also, if any creatures provoke an opportunity attack from it, it must attack if it's able to. However, this effect has no effect on someone who's immune to the frightened condition. Now, what's really great about this is that it essentially removes one target from combat, while also granting you some extra damage. So you get a 2-for-1 from this, but only if you're able to position it correctly. The best way to use it is on a creature that's in the middle of an enemy group of mobs. That way, they have a higher chance of just attacking one of their nearby allies. And they'll most likely get off that opportunity attack because their allies will have to move closer in range in order to engage in combat, and they won't be worried about an opportunity attack from one of their allies. However, if you're just fighting a lone enemy, this spell is completely useless because it will just choose one of your party members as its random target. Also, it does have a chance to just attack your party members. It doesn't have to attack its allies, it just chooses its target at random, which could mean whatever your DM decides. However, another downside is that each time the target takes damage, they get to attempt the saving throw again in order to break the spell. So as soon as it starts attacking things, it might actually break the spell after getting hit by a single attack, which is not very good for a 3rd level spell slot. Or you can get a whole bunch of mileage out of it since it targets intelligence as its saving throw, which is one of the best saving throws to target against most of the monsters in the monster manual. Another niche thing about the spell is that if you're a sorcerer who can subtle cast it, you can cause some mayhem with the spell if you use it in a crowded location in order to start a distraction. Like if you subtle cast enemies abound on someone in a bar who just starts attacking people, people might think they've just gone crazy and started attacking things for no reason. And it's also a great spell for an enemy bad guy to cast on players for basically the same effect, in order to try to give them bad renown within the city. And at number 7, we have Hunger of Hadar. This is a Warlock only AoE, which creates a 20-foot radius sphere of blackness and cold, where everything inside the radius is considered blind as no light that's magical or otherwise can illuminate the area. And if a creature starts its turn inside the area, they automatically take 2d6 cold damage without a saving throw, and then if they end their turn inside the area, they then get to make a saving throw or else take 2d6 acid damage as well. And while inside the area, it's considered difficult terrain. So everything you put inside the Hunger of Hadar has half movement because of the difficult terrain and are also blinded, so they're definitely going to want to try to get out so they can actually start attacking things without disadvantage. But if you are able to keep them in there longer, then they're just going to constantly take damage. And if the creature stays in there for 2 turns and fails both of its saving throws, then they take damage equivalent to a fireball, or thinking of it in another way, if they only take the damage once, they only take half the damage of a fireball. So the mileage you get out of its damage is heavily dependent on how you're able to actually keep them inside the Hunger of Hadar. This spell does do a good job of keeping things inside of it on its own, but it definitely can benefit from extra support, like maybe pushing them back inside of it if they try to get out with the pulse wave. This spell is an excellent area of control effect, which also deals some decent damage if they stay in there for too long, which makes it a really good spell to pick on a Warlock, especially since they don't have access to Fireball baseline anyway. And at number 6, we have Major Image. This spell basically allows you to create a super realistic illusion just as long as it fits within a 20-foot cube, which is pretty big. Whatever you create, it looks, sounds, and even smells like a completely real thing. So if you try to create an illusion of a dragon, you'll be able to hear its sounds, smell dragon breath, or whatever is needed in order to sell the illusion as being real. And the applications of being able to create an illusion that seems completely real is entirely dependent on how creative you are personally, or how your DM rules with illusions. There are rules with Major Image, where a creature can use an action in order to investigate the illusion, where if they pass an investigation check against your spell save DC, they'll be able to discern that it's an illusion and see through the image. However, this is where DM participation really plays a major factor in the usefulness of Major Image. If you, for example, use Major Image to create a wall of fire, which completely blocks off an area where your enemies can't go around it. The wall of fire will give off heat similar to an actual fire, but it's not hot enough to deal any damage. So to your enemies, it will look exactly like a wall of fire, which normally should stop them from trying to go through it if they think it would kill them. However, they do have the option to perform an investigation check to see through it, but whether they should actually attempt the investigation check or not is hotly up to debate. Because normally, if they just see a wall of fire immediately appear in front of them, there's no reason for them to think it's fake, especially since they can feel the heat. So there would be no need to do an investigation check. If a dragon appears behind a wall and then comes out, chances are a whole bunch of enemy creatures aren't going to try to investigate to see if it's real, because they'll be too busy running away. There's a lot of official modules which have very scary creatures show up, and the modules are set up in a way where it assumes your players will try to run away from it. And normally, your players aren't trying to see if it's an illusion first before running. So this is where DM trickery can really make or break how useful an illusion is, on whether they're willing to just let creatures pretend it's real without any checks or not. Because if a whole bunch of creatures all perform investigation checks at once, chances are one of them will find out it's fake and then just tell the others. And the chances are pretty high if you have enough people doing that check. So if the illusion is good enough, realistically a DM should not have to roll anything and just have the creatures act as if whatever you created the illusion of was actually real. However, sometimes the players are not as clever as they think. If you're fighting a group of orcs out in the open and your player uses Major Image to summon a mini Tarrasque, I think it would probably be appropriate for the orcs to scratch their head a little bit that a mythical creature just appeared in front of them out of nowhere. which would definitely constitute some kind of probable investigation check to determine an illusion or not, where this can make the player who used the illusion mad because they thought it was a super good idea. This is why a lot of tables just kind of avoid using illusion spells, because there's a lot of wiggle room on what should or should not require an investigation check, which should just inspire fear immediately and have things run away, or if their illusions are even a good idea that would do anything. However, in theory, illusions are super great, and Major Image is an excellent spell in theory, especially if you cast it with a 6th level spell slot or higher. The illusion becomes permanent, which allows Major Image to be an excellent DM tool in order to place traps inside of dungeons, because you can just say it was placed there with the 6th level version of it. And at number 5, we have Dispel Magic and Tongue. These are two really niche situational spells, where their niche usefulness comes up quite more often than most other niche spells. Dispel Magic allows you to dispel magical effects, where you can choose a creature or object or magical effect that you can see within range, and if the effect was a 3rd level spell or lower, the effect just ends. If the effect is 4th level or higher, then you need to make an ability check using your spellcaster modifier in order to try to dispel it. So if you come across an enemy creature who set up a Leomid's tiny hut, you can just get rid of it with Dispel Magic and make them a lot more vulnerable. And there's usually a lot of magical traps within dungeons that you can get rid of with a Dispel Magic. Like if your DM used Major Image to set up some kind of illusion that your party somehow knew about. And Tongues simply grants whoever casts the ability to understand any language it hears, as well as allow anyone who can hear it speaking understand what's said. It doesn't actually teach you any languages, but allows the person who's under the effect to effectively communicate with anyone that has a language. There are some creatures in the game which don't have any languages, like most beasts, so it won't allow you to speak with them, but if they do have some kind of exotic language, it's an excellent way to be able to communicate. There are some DMs who just won't have anyone speak exotic languages in their game, so Tongues might not be very useful at all. But in pretty much every official module and game that I've ran, there has been a couple of instances where problems arise because the party could just not speak to whomever they were talking to because of the language barrier, which Tongues is very helpful at removing. And since the ability to need to be able to speak to people in different languages, and the ability to dispel things comes up more often than needing the ability to breathe underwater, these two spells are some of the better niche spells you can pick up at this level. And at number 4, we have Fear. Now, Fear as the spell is different from the Frightened condition, and the Frightened condition isn't very good, so I'm sure a lot of people write off this Fear spell as not very good either, just because of its really generic name. But it's actually one of the best control spells at the 3rd level. It's just there's a lot of really good control spells in the 3rd level, so it's overshadowed a bit, as what it does is allow you to target each creature within a 30-foot cone in front of you, where they have to succeed a wisdom saving throw, otherwise they drop whatever they're holding and become frightened for up to a minute, or until you lose concentration. And while they're frightened by the spell, in addition to having the Frightened condition applied to them, they gain extra negative benefits, where they have to perform the dash action on their turn in order to move away from you in the safest available route on each of their turns. Unless there's literally nowhere else to move, and since the Frightened condition has the effect where they can't willingly move closer to you, it is possible they might be stuck in a corner of a wall and not be able to run around you in order to get away further. In addition, if the creature is able to end its turn in a location where they don't have line of sight of you anymore, then they can make another wisdom saving throw in order to try to end the effect on themselves. So, what's great about Fear is that it takes up the creature's action in order to perform the dash action, which makes it effectively crowd control as they can't use that action for something else, but also forcing them to drop their weapons where they might be completely disarmed if they do end the effect, and there's a chance they'll just keep having the crowd control active if they get stuck in a corner and can't move away from you anymore, where they don't actually get to attempt the saving throw unless they are specifically out of line of sight. So, there's a good chance that the Fear will just be a straight up a 1 minute long crowd control effect, where the enemy is stuck using their action to perform a dash action each turn, even if they're no longer able to move. So, Fear really plays to the strength of the Frightened condition, as it's possible to block a creature from being able to get out of your line of sight, because they're not allowed to run closer towards you at all, which can turn Fear into a really powerful save or suck spell, where if a creature fails the saving throw a single time, they might be out of the combat for a full minute. As another really important distinction of the spell is that you don't get an additional try at ending the effect if you take any damage. So if you do fear someone into a corner and they can't move anymore, you can just keep on attacking them and they can't really do anything about it. Whereas most similar effects like this break or have a chance to break if they take damage. However, the big downside to the spell is the fact that a lot of creatures are just immune to the frightened condition, as if they weren't, Fear would be just an excellent spell to use on pretty much everything, and then just attack it while they can't attack back, unless they're one of those few creatures that has a bonus action that allows them to do something, as a lot of monsters in the monster manuals don't actually have bonus action abilities. And at number 3, we have Haste. This has got to be one of the most overrated 3rd level spells in the game, because it feels super good to have the effect on you if you're a melee character. What it does is it allows you to buff one target in order to grant them a multitude of extra effects until the duration ends. Where they get a +2 bonus to their AC, they gain advantage on dexterity saving throws, their speed is doubled, and they gain an additional action on each of their turns, which can only be used to perform one weapon attack, a dash, disengage, a hide, or use an object action. So it kind of has all of these restrictions on what you can do with this extra action, that way players can't use it in order to perform a multi-attack, and also so spellcasters can't use it to double cast spells. However, when the spell ends, the target can't move or take actions until its next turn. And since haste requires concentration, if whoever casts the spell is hit too many times and accidentally drops it, whoever they use it on will be out of combat for a turn. So if you cast haste on a melee character, it basically allows them to perform one extra weapon attack on each of their turns. However, the damage of having one extra weapon attack is usually a lot lower than just hitting a room full of enemies with Fireball. If we take the highest damage die weapon, something like a greatsword with a 2d6, the average damage of the greatsword is 7. And the average damage of Fireball hitting a single target is 28. So a creature with haste on them would have to hit 4 times with an extra attack before being able to equal the damage of a Fireball hitting one target, assuming no other modifiers in the weapon. And this is kind of why this spell is overrated. Its actual damage potential is vastly underpowered compared to a lot of the other damaging spells. However, it does more than just grant extra damage. It also provides double speed, which is actually super good for maneuvering around the battlefield, and can potentially allow the character to end behind cover on every turn, which is great as a defensive capability. Plus, a +2 bonus to their AC is nothing to scoff at, especially since it's basically permanent for the duration of the spell, and can be stacked on top of something like a shield as well. So, if you're able to get the full benefits off of everything that haste provides, then it's definitely a great spell to cast, especially if you twin cast it onto 2 targets as a sorcerer. Although it does have a pretty gnarly downside if you end the concentration, and if used as a pure damaging spell, it's just not better than using Fireball. And at number 2, we have Slow. Slow is an AoE which can affect up to 6 creatures of your choice within a 40-foot cube, where each creature has to succeed a Wisdom saving throw, otherwise they get a negative effect, which is kind of like the opposite of haste, where they get a -2 penalty to their AC and dexterity saving throws, they can't use any reactions, and on their turn, they can choose to perform an action or bonus action, but not both. And also, regardless of its abilities or magic items, it can't make more than one attack during its turn. And additionally, if the creature attempts to cast a spell under the effect, they have to roll a d20, where if they roll an 11 or higher, the spell doesn't actually take effect until the creature's next turn, and the creature has to use its action on the next turn in order to complete the cast of that spell. And creatures under the effect can make an additional Wisdom saving throw at the end of each of their turns in order to end the effect early. Otherwise, it lasts for a full minute or until you drop concentration. Now, what's really good about Slow is in the way you can cast it on an enemy group, which does not affect your ally's baseline. Pretty much all AoE spells you can cast at 3rd level spell range affect all creatures within range regardless if they're enemies or not. Since Slow allows you to specifically choose up to 6 targets, that means you can completely ignore any allies that might be within its radius. And the negative effect it places on creatures makes them easier to hit, makes it so they have 50% chance to take 2 turns to cast a spell, makes them slower as it halves their speeds, and reduces them to only performing one action and completely renders multi-attack features useless, which is what most high-level creatures have. So even though most creatures in the monster manual don't have a bonus action, a lot of them do have the multi-attack feature, which they can't really use because they're only allowed to perform one attack on their turn. And since it just halves their speed, if they're in an area of difficult terrain, like a Hunger of Hadar or Sleet Storm, they'll only be moving at 1/4 of their normal speed because it does stack. So, while the negative effects of Slow might not be as game-changing as Fear, the fact that you can use it in the middle of a group that has both allies and enemies and only affects your enemies is a really big plus in its favor. There are very few control spells or AoEs that work this way, so they're super valuable if they do have this benefit. And at number 1, we have Summon Undead. This is a spell from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and basically what it does is allow you to call forth one of 3 undead spirits to a space within 90 feet, which then takes its turn immediately after you in the initiative count and obeys all of your commands without requiring any actions by you. And of the 3 undead you're able to summon with the spell, pretty much all 3 of them are good and in most combat encounters. In addition to all of the undeads having immunity to necrotic and poison damage, plus immunity to a couple of other conditions, the way they differ is that the ghost is able to fly and move through objects, plus anything it hits with its attack has to succeed at the wisdom saving throw, otherwise they become frightened of the ghost until the end of their next turn. The putrid has an AoE poison effect, where any creature that starts its turn within 5 feet of the spirit has to succeed a constitution saving throw against your spell save DC, otherwise get poisoned until the start of their next turn. And the putrid's melee attack Rotting Claw has the effect where if the target it's attacking is poisoned, then they have to succeed a constitution saving throw against your spell save DC, or else be paralyzed until the end of its next turn. And the paralyzed condition is nasty, where all attack rolls against the target have advantage, and if an attack hits a creature that's paralyzed within 5 feet of them, the attack is a critical hit automatically. Although this does require a target to fail 2 constitution saving throws, which are usually on the high end when it comes to creatures from the monster manual. And the last one is a skeleton, who doesn't have any extra effects, except it's the only one that has a ranged attack, where it can attack things at a range of 150 feet, and deals slightly more damage than the other 2 spirits, at 2d4 plus 3 when cast at 3rd level. So if you summon the ghost, you can have it move through walls in order to position itself to frighten things or go after flying targets. If you summon the putrid, you can summon in the middle of an enemy group in order to try to poison them, and then maybe paralyze one of them. Or you can just summon the skeleton hanging out next to you and it can just spam its grave bolts, almost like having your own miniature warlock. And if you cast Summon Undead at 4th level, then all of the 3 creatures gain the ability to attack twice on each of their turns. And it's kind of better to just upcast Summon Undead than use any of the 4th level summon spells. Summon Undead is an excellent new spell that was added to the game, and was good enough to almost make it into the actual top 10 of 3rd level spells, but since it was rather new when I made that first video, I kind of underrated it a little bit, which means it easily takes number 1 spot in the part 2 of the video instead. In this video, we'll be going over all the best 4th level spells, which is a pretty high level spell slot, as most classes don't gain access to it until level 7. And at number 10, we have Vitriolic Sphere, as well as some other damage dealing 4th level spells. The best way to describe Vitriolic Sphere is that it's a 4th level version of Fireball. It deals the most amount of AoE damage in one burst, it has the exact same range and radius as Fireball, and the only difference being that it deals acid damage instead of fire, which is much less resisted, and it doesn't do all of its damage at once, as it leaves a little AoE dot on every one hit, which deals the rest of the damage on their next turn. So the initial damage of Vitriolic Sphere is slightly less than the initial damage of Fireball, at only 25 damage on average per target hit, compared to Fireball's 28 damage. But the dot component, which activates at the end of the target's turn, adds an additional 13 extra damage with its 5d6 acid, which is more damage than a Fireball if it's cast with a 4th level spell slot. So, if you just want to hit a whole bunch of targets with a lot of damage and not have to worry about anything else, and you have a 4th level spell slot available, then Vitriolic Sphere is one of the best bets. It's just a straight up upgraded version of Fireball, assuming creatures are able to live for at least 1 turn to take that extra damage. Although if your problem is creatures dying too quickly, then I don't think that really matters. However, when it comes to the AoE damage for 4th level spells, there are a lot of other spells which can potentially do a lot more damage, since most of them spread their damage out over long concentrations. So if you have some way to control a group of enemies in order to keep them in place, then Sickening Radiance is one of the best AoEs you can use at the 4th level, as it deals 22 damage on average every turn, so after 2 turns it deals more damage than a single Vitriolic Sphere. And Sickening Radiance has a duration of 10 minutes, and also grants levels of exhaustion every time it deals its damage, reveals invisible creatures that fail the saving throw for it, and even has a bigger radius of 30 feet. And Sickening Radiance is a pretty well-known spell to use with Force Cage, because if you just cast Sickening Radiance first, and then trap someone inside of it with a Force Cage, then they'll be taking the damage every turn and eventually die to 6 levels of exhaustion, if the massive amount of damage doesn't kill them first. But if all you care about is single target damage, then there's only really 2 options when it comes to blasting spells at this level. You have Blight, which has a 30-foot range. It allows you to deal 8d8 necrotic damage to one target, which is around 36 damage on average, slightly less damage than what Vitriolic Sphere does to one target. And there's also the new spell, Ralothum's Psychic Lance, which has a much longer range of 120 feet, but deals even less damage at only 7d6 psychic, or 25 damage on average. However, it has a benefit where you can hit creatures that you don't actually have line of sight of, just as long as you know their name. Not their true name or anything, just whatever their name is. So it's an excellent way for hitting a big bad evil guy behind a wall, if that's what you're trying to aim at. And the reason I talk about all of these damaging spells at this spot is because none of the other pure damaging spells are going to appear at higher spots on this list. The damage potential of 4th level spells is kind of mediocre, and a lot of the best uses of 4th level spells are for non-direct damage applications or summoning. And at number 9, we have Giant Insect. This is a spell that only druids have access to, which allows you to transform some insects into giant versions of themselves, where you can then control them by giving them commands, but then your DM has to resolve their actions and movements. So, Giant Insect is a summoning-like spell that allows you to summon a whole bunch of creatures, but unlike a lot of the other conjure animal-like spells, you can actually directly choose which creatures you're summoning, as you have to provide the insects that you're turning into giant versions of themselves as part of the spell. So as long as you just carry around bottles of insects, you should always be able to summon whatever you want, and pretty much all the options are good. If you summon 10 giant centipedes, then they have the potential to deal 140 damage in a round with all of their attacks, which is way more damage than anything else on this list will be able to dish out in one turn to one target. Although, this is purely theoretical damage. When you're at level 7, giant centipedes are not going to be hitting most of their attacks, and most things they're attacking will probably be immune to poison, or have some kind of AoE to take out all of the low health centipedes you summon. So it's not the best option, but it is a high damaging potential one. The 3 spiders you can summon are really good for crowd control with their webs, the 5 wasps are good for attacking flying enemies, and the scorpion has blind sight and is one of the hardest hitting CR3 creatures in the game. Now technically there are quite a bit of summoning spells at the 4th level, including the really overpowered one called Conjure Woodland Beings. Although the reason I have Giant Insect over a lot of those Conjure ones is just because you can control what you actually summon, and the options are actually pretty good too. Whereas with Conjure Woodland Beings, the best thing you can summon is 8 pixies, who can polymorph your entire party into T-Rexes, although by rules as written, your DM is the one who chooses what you summon with those spells, so they can just not allow you to summon pixies, and it's perfectly within the rules of how the spell works. That's why the control of giant insects is really nice. But if your DM does allow you to pick whatever you want to summon for your conjure spells, then Conjure Woodland Beings is better, and kind of overpowered even with that pixie combo. And at number 8, we have Summon Aberration. This is a spell from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything that allows you to summon an aberrant spirit, which can take one of 3 forms that you choose. You can pick a Beholderkin, which is a flying ranged attacker, a Slad, which is a frontline bruiser, or a Starspawn, which is also a melee fighter, but has some AoE damage. Out of all 3 options to summon, pretty much all 3 of them are useful in different situations. The Beholderkin is pretty useful in more situations, since it has a ranged attack that deals psychic damage, which you can use 2 times at the 4th level, or 3 times if you cast it with the 6th level spell slot. And since it can also fly and hover, it's basically a flying machine gun. The Slad is a pretty nice frontline bruiser, as it technically has the hardest hitting attacks with its multi-attack, but its damage is purely physical in nature. So if you're fighting against creatures that have resistances to non-magic weapon damage, then it's going to deal less damage than the other 2 options. It does also heal for 5 health every turn though, so it has quite the staying power when compared to the other 2 summons. And lastly, the Starspawn deals psychic damage with its melee attacks, and has an aura that deals AoE damage, although since it's not as tanky as the Slad, nor does it have a regeneration trait, it's most likely going to die pretty quickly if you do send it into melee in order to make use of its AoE aura. Even then, all 3 options are good. The Beholderkin's ranged attacks are probably the best of both situations, and you get to keep the summon for a full hour or until it dies, so you might be able to have the thing for an entire dungeon, and having the option of a ranged attacker is pretty rare for spells that summon creatures. So it's much easier to position the Beholderkin than a lot of the other singular summon spells. Especially when compared to something like Summon Greater Demon, where it just brings out a CR5 demon that goes hog wild, and you have a very high chance of losing control of the creature before its duration is finished naturally. Plus, the DM can choose to summon a lower CR demon since the spell doesn't let you pick the CR level like most summon spells do. And at number 7, we have Find Greater Steed. This is a spell that only paladins have access to, and basically allows them to spend 10 minutes summoning a permanent mount that they can ride, which lasts until they manually dismiss it, or until it drops to 0 hit points. So having a spell that summons a permanent creature is pretty good, which is why there's lots of restrictions on the creature that you can summon, as well on what it's able to do, as you can just use a day in which you don't actually use your spells to summon the creature, then you have it for every other day. When you cast a spell, you're allowed to choose from 6 different options, or 1 more if you have Fizzbank's Treasury of Dragons. And one of the best options you can pick is just the Pegasus. The Pegasus has the fastest land and flying movement speed, is a large size, so medium-sized creatures can ride on it no problem, and basically has permanent flight speed. And the movement speed is one of the most important parts of the steed, because the damage potential of the creature is kind of negligible, as you're not really using them for their damage. Because, as per the rules of mounted combat, if you're mounted on a controlled creature, then you can't take the attack action on it, and it can only take a couple of other actions which basically involve movement or dodging. But a mount can attack if it's an uncontrolled mount, and as confirmed by Sage Advice, you can choose for this mount to be controlled or independent in combat. So if you want to actually do any kind of damage with it, you can declare it's independent and let your DM control it in battle with its own initiative roll and everything. Although, with how weak most of them are at 7th level, the best use of these animals is just to ride them as a controlled mount. And at number 6, we have Shadow of Moil. This is a spell that only Warlocks can cast, which basically treats them as if they're invisible, without actually going invisible. And also it has a Thorns-like effect, where if someone within 10 feet of you tries to attack you, you deal 2d8 necrotic damage to them for each attack. The effect lasts for 1 minute and has a concentration requirement, so if you get hit too much, you might actually end the effect. So, to be more specific on how this works, it basically treats your character as heavily obscured, and what that means is that everyone who sees you is essentially blinded, so they have disadvantage on attack rolls against you, and you have advantage on attack rolls against them. It also has some other effects which interact with light, where dim light within 10 feet of you is converted into darkness, and any bright light goes down to dim light. However, this does not convert dim light into magical darkness, just normal darkness, so someone who has dark vision should still be able to see what this spell is creating. The light effect of it does have some niche uses, but really, the best part of this is how it's basically a pseudo greater invisibility, but also has some Thorns damage attached to it. And having advantage on all your attacks is incredibly good for Warlocks who try to fish for crits with their Eldritch Blasts. And at number 5, we have Dominate Beast. This is a spell which basically allows you to take control over an enemy beast for 1 minute if they fail a Wisdom saving throw, which most beast-type creatures are really bad at. However, unlike most charm-like spells, this one actually allows you to basically convert the beast you take over into an ally that helps you fight, as you're able to give it mental commands to attack creatures or run and fetch objects, or you can use your action to take direct control over it if you want to control it more precisely. Although each time the beast takes damage, it gets to perform another saving throw, where if it succeeds, it ends the effect. Now, what makes this spell really good is that it basically allows you to completely counter an entire creature type, because being able to simultaneously remove one enemy from a battle and also gain an ally at the same time is like getting 2 powerful effects in one. It's a hard CC and a summon spell put together. Although if you're in a game where you know you're never going to go against any beast, obviously it's not that useful. It's just incredibly useful if you do run into beast-type creatures, which is a pretty common type to run against. And at number 4, we have Dimension Door. This is a teleportation spell which allows you to teleport to a place that's within 500 feet, at a spot that you can see, one that you can visualize, or one that you just kind of give distance and directions to, like 200 feet straight downwards or 5 feet through a door, etc, etc. Just as long as you don't teleport inside an object or creature, where you'll then take some force damage and the spell will fail. And the generous range of this 500 feet basically means Dimension Door is simultaneously a great escape tool, a gap closer, or a sequence breaking tool by just teleporting through walls. And you get to do all of this while taking a friend with you, as it allows you to bring one other creature just as long as you and the other creature are only holding enough weight that you're able to carry with your carrying capacity. Dimension Door can kind of break the game if you're creative with it, by just allowing you to completely skip things or get away from almost any battle, because if you're underground in a dungeon fighting a monster and things are going south, you can have Dimension Door teleport you roughly 300 feet directly in the air and you'll be right outside. Or if you're in a room where you have to navigate traps in order to get to a destination that you know about, you can use Dimension Door to immediately go to that spot without having to deal with any traps or creatures. Dimension Door is one of the ultimate tools you can use if you have some kind of scouting tool, like a Find Familiar or Arcane Eye, because you can just teleport yourself and one other person directly to whatever location that you know about, as long as you're within 500 feet of it, of course. And teleportation is always just very strong in D&D, and Dimension Door is definitely a pretty good one, that a lot of spellcasters have access to. And at number 3, we have Banishment. Banishment is a hard crowd control effect, where if the target creature fails a charisma saving throw, they get banished to another plane of existence for 1 minute. So it's a complete save or suck spell, where if the enemy creature fails the saving throw, they're basically out of the battle for the entire combat. Unless you drop your concentration, in which case they return early. But there's no other saving throws on the creature's part. It's just one and done saving throw, which is pretty rare for crowd control like spells. There is another spell like this in the 4th level range, like Otilik's Resilient Sphere, which does something similar and will lock someone inside a little ball for 1 minute. However, what makes Banishment better is the extra effect it has, where if the target is not native to the plane of existence you're currently on, then it gets sent back to whatever its native plane is, and then stays there if the concentration lasts for the full minute. And in an average game of D&D, pretty much all elementals, demons, devils, and celestials are from different planes of existence. So if you're facing off against a group of a whole bunch of fire elementals, then it's possible to just completely win the encounter with a single cast of Banishment. Because another advantage it has over Resilient Sphere is that it can target one additional creature for each higher level spell slot you use to cast it. So if you use a 6th level spell slot, for example, you can banish up to 3 creatures. So against certain kinds of enemies, you can just instantly remove them from the battle permanently, which is definitely one of the strongest abilities you can have from a spellcast. And it's because of abilities like Banishment that most boss monsters have advantage in all saving throws, and then legendary resistances in order to make sure they're not instantly defeated by a cast of Banishment, or other instant win-like effects. And at number 2, we have Greater Invisibility. This is a very simple spell which simply allows you to turn a creature invisible for up to 1 minute, and the creature stays invisible for that full minute, or until you lose concentration on the spell, which is a distinction that's important because there is also a 2nd level spell called Invisibility, which also allows you to turn creatures invisible. However, that one breaks as soon as you attack or cast a spell, and Greater Invisibility is just a more combat-focused form of invisibility, which is an excellent buff to cast on any kind of character that relies primarily on attack rolls for their damage. Like a warlock who uses lots of Eldritch Blast, a character which has a great weapon master or sharpshooter, or a rogue who can get sneak attack easily, as invisibility gives you advantage on all of your attacks, and also disadvantage on all attacks against you. It also makes it so your opponent can't target you with spells which require them to target a creature that they can see, so it's also a good spell to cast on a spellcaster who's trying to avoid a counter spell. So there's hardly a bad target in order to cast Greater Invisibility on, as it's useful in pretty much every battle situation, on pretty much everyone in the party, and even has uses outside of combat too, because of just how useful invisibility is. And the only reason it's on a higher spot on this list than Shadow of Moil, which is basically the same thing, is because Greater Invisibility is actually an invisibility, and it's just easier to use, plus is usable by way more classes than just warlocks. And at number 1, we have Polymorph. This is a spell which allows you to transform a creature into a beast that has a challenge rating equal to its level. And if you try to use it on an enemy creature, they have to fail a saving throw, otherwise it doesn't work on them. Now, what's really good about Polymorph is the fact that you normally get it at around level 7. So, you already have a whole bunch of really good creatures you can turn yourself or your party members into. One of the best beasts you can turn anyone into is the Tyrannosaurus Rex, although you can't do that until you're at least level 8. Immediately at level 7, you can turn a creature into a giant ape, which is unique as it's one of the beast forms that actually has a decently high intelligence and an actual ranged attack. Since you do take on the characteristics of the beast whenever you transform into them, the giant ape will allow them to still be somewhat effective in contributing to a battle, as Polymorph also gives them a 2nd health bar essentially, which is most times going to be way bigger than their original health, which is definitely one of the main benefits of the ability, allowing someone to take a whole bunch of damage before you lose concentration and go back into their normal form. Although if you use the spell on yourself, and you try to go into melee and attack things as a Tyrannosaurus Rex for example, then you will have to do concentration saving throws every time you take damage. So one of the best ways to use it is on somebody else, who isn't concentrating on the spell. And Polymorph can also just be used as a control spell on an enemy target. Like if you want to disable a particularly deadly creature and then attack all of its friends without worry. In which case you can just turn them into a tiny little rat. That way they have the intelligence of a rat and can't do much. Although they will have the movement speed of a rat, so there's a chance they might get away, or, since they have such little HP, lose the transformation if they take any kind of stray AoE damage. In which case, surprisingly, one of the best things you can turn an enemy creature into would be a killer whale, since they have 0 movement speed on land and also a pretty decent health pool. so they can survive some accidental AoE damage without being depolymorphed. Plus, they won't die of suffocation, since they have a trait to breathe air for 30 minutes, so they'll just be stuck in one square, not able to move or interact with combat unless something comes near them or puts them underwater. Polymorph is just a really good spell for both of its applications, even if it's more useful to turn a party member into a giant ape or Tyrannosaurus Rex. In fact, it's so good that Warlocks even have an invocation that simply allows them to use the spell once, and even requires them to use a spell slot, and it's considered one of their better invocations. The only downside to Polymorph is that it's so good that you might feel like you need to use it all the time, and you might not have as much fun playing as a giant ape as you would just playing your normal class. Most players gain access to their 5th level spells when they reach level 9, so in this video we'll be going over some of the best spells you can probably pick up once you have the availability of 5th level spells. And at number 10, we have Dance Macabre from Xanader's Guide to Everything. This is a spell that basically allows you to turn 5 corpses within a 60-foot range into either zombies or skeletons. Now, normally at level 9, a zombie or skeleton isn't really going to be much of a match against other creatures at this level. However, the spell also grants the zombie summoned an increase to their attack and damage rolls equal to your spell casting ability modifier, so they're much more likely to actually hit targets you're sticking them on. Because as a bonus action, you can mentally command the creatures to do whatever you want, like just give them the general command to attack all of your enemies. And if you pick 5 skeletons who all have a short bow, you can do a potential 50 damage in one turn with all of them attacking a single creature, if you have a 20 in your spellcasting stat, as that will give them a +9 chance to hit, and an additional 5 damage on top of the 1d6 + 2 they already deal. And with a +9 to hit, you're actually going to be landing a lot of those at the 9th level, as that's the same as your character's spellcasting attack bonus. However, all of the damage is non-magic piercing, so creatures might be resistant or immune depending on what creatures you're fighting. Also, skeletons are pretty weak with only 13 hit points on average, only having 13 AC, and not actually doing any more damage if you get them close into melee to attack. The zombies deal 1 less damage on average, but are a lot more tankier, with 22 hit points on average and having the Undead Fortitude trait, which can cause them to survive a hit that would otherwise kill them. What's great about Dance Macabre is the fact that it's one of the few spells in the game that actually allows you to control a horde of undead creatures, if you really want to play a necromancer-like character, as it just straight up gives you a small army of zombies or skeletons, and is definitely on this list because it's one of those spells that I think is really cool, even if technically it might not be as useful as some of the higher spots on this list. You can give the zombies other kinds of commands for the hour duration, like go up ahead to see if there's any traps, or to stay the entrance and guard a door. There's lots of other versatile uses of the spell besides just having a little horde to fight for you. However, one of the main drawbacks to the spell is obviously the requirement in order to use it in the first place, where you need to have 5 corpses at the ready. And when the spell ends, the corpses don't get destroyed, so you could potentially just carry around 5 corpses with you at all times in order to always have the materials needed in order to cast the spell. But that would be difficult and might get you into trouble with local guards. And in this spot, I'd also like to mention another 5th level spell with the same flavor, called the Negative Energy Flood, also from Xanader's. This is a single target damaging spell, which deals around 33 damage on average if the target fails the Constitution save, and half the damage if they succeed. And also, if the damage kills the creature, it turns it into a hostile zombie that will attack whatever is nearby. Now, the damage from Negative Energy Flood is not that great for a 5th level spell, as it actually does less damage than just casting a fireball at 5th level, and that's assuming the fireball is only hitting one target, which is all you can hit with Negative Energy Flood, as it's a single target spell. But if you finish off a target and it gets turned into a zombie, that's just some fun flavor if you're playing a necromancer-like character, because the damage it deals to a single target is not insignificant. It's just technically worse than some of the other damaging spells available at this level. And at number 9, we have Synaptic Static from Xanader's Guide to Everything. This spell is basically a psychic fireball, where it literally has the same radius and damage as the 3rd level spell Fireball, but it deals psychic damage and requires an intelligence saving throw instead of a dexterity one, which allows it to deal a better type of damage. And to learn more about the best types of damage, check out the video on the top 10 best damage types. It also targets a better save, as most monsters typically have a lower intelligence and a dexterity score. But what makes this spell really good is the fact that creatures affected by the spell who failed the saving throw also receive a debuff for 1 minute, which basically makes it so they have a negative 1d6 chance to succeed at things, where their attacks, ability checks, and constitution saving throws specifically to maintain concentration all have a negative 1d6 penalty attached to them while under the effects of Synaptic Static. The target under the effect can make an intelligence saving throw at the end of each of their turns in order to try and end the effect early. So if you want to debuff a whole group of enemies while also dealing damage to them, and like a huge group of them because it's a 20-foot radius and will target the worst stat for monsters in the monster manual, then Synaptic Static is really good for that purpose. However, its damage is low for a 5th level spell, because it's exactly the same as the 3rd level spell, Fireball. However, the 3rd level spell's damage is overpowered for its level, so if you're just a person who really likes Fireball related spells, or just simple spells that have really good effects, Synaptic Static is excellent in that regard. However, if you just want pure AoE damage from a 5th level spell, we'll go over the best ones for that in the next spot on this list. And at number 8, we have Cone of Cold. This is a 60-foot AoE cone spell which deals 88 cold damage to all targets inside of it that fail a Constitution saving throw, which means it deals 1 more average damage than a Fireball upcasted to 5th level. And it also deals the most AoE damage of all the 5th level spells, aside from a few that we'll talk about in a little bit. However, some downsides to Cone of Cold is that Constitution is one of the worst saving throws to target on enemy creatures, because most monsters have really high con scores. Cold damage is very commonly resistant and immune, but then again, so is fire, so it is heavily dependent on what campaign you're in. In Rime of the Frost Maiden, you'll be screwed, while in Descent into Avernus, you'll probably be fine. Just be wary of Ice Devils. Also, a cone is kind of unruly to position correctly. It requires you to kind of get close in order to hit a large amount of mobs. But it does have the neat effect where if a creature is killed by the spell, they become a frozen statue until it thaws. Now, when it comes to other AoE spells at this level which can kind of match the damage of Cone of Cold, we have Conjure Volley, which is a 5th level ranger spell that creates a 40-foot radius, 20-foot high cylinder effect that deals 88 damage to each target inside of it on a failed dexterity saving throw, or half as much on a success. So Conjure Volley might be one of the largest AoEs at this level, and it deals just as much damage as Cone of Cold. However, it can only be used by rangers, and they don't gain access to 5th level spells until level 17. And at level 17, this damage is kinda mediocre, when compared to all the other spellcasters getting their 9th level spells. But if you're playing a class which can take this spell at around 9th level, like maybe a bard with their Magical Secrets ability, then it's just as much damage as a Cone of Cold. There's also another 5th level spell that deals around the same amount of damage, that being Destructive Wave, which is a 5th level paladin spell that deals 1 less average damage than Cone of Cold and Conjure Volley, and is also not obtainable until 17th level, just like Conjure Volley. And for the same reason as Conjure Volley, as paladins, like rangers, do not get 5th level spells until level 17. So it's not that good because you don't get it until the 17th level. Unless, of course, you take it early through some other class feature. So out of all the hardest hitting AoE abilities at the 5th level, Cone of Cold is the only one that you can actually get at level 9, which is why it's on this list above the other damaging AoE spells. Because sometimes people just want to deal the most amount of damage with your spells, and don't care too much about the extra effects they might have. And at number 7, we have Telekinesis. This is a very versatile spell that basically allows you to pick up objects that weigh less than 1,000 pounds without any kind of check, and move them in any way you want up to 30 feet around. Out of combat in a dungeon scenario, it's a great way to open doors and avoid traps or just move heavy obstacles out of the way. These are things that come up quite frequently, or just do anything else that requires heavy lifting, like freeing a trapped treant. In combat, telekinesis can be used in order to restrain a target in the air, which means all attacks versus them have advantage. Their attacks have disadvantage, and if they break free of telekinesis, unless they can fly, they will fall to the ground, knocking them prone, which means they can't easily get to the spellcaster who was just holding them in the air 30 feet away. You can also use it to pluck an item away from someone who's carrying it, which could be very important if the bad guy you're going against has a very powerful item that he's using against you, as with this spell, you can kinda just easily remove it from them, or just keep trying every turn because telekinesis lasts for 10 minutes. And while only restraining or trying to disarm a creature might not sound that good for a 5th level spell that focuses on control, one of the best things about telekinesis in a boss fight is that it doesn't ask for a saving throw, and instead a contest of ability checks. And what this means, mechanically speaking, is that it avoids the legendary resistances from bosses. Most higher level monsters, and more specifically boss monsters, have this thing called legendary resistances, where 3 times a day they can just automatically succeed a saving throw. So it's really hard to use control spells on a boss while they still have legendary resistances up, as even if they fail to save, they can just choose to succeed it instead. However, since telekinesis doesn't call for a saving throw, they have to make the rolls like normal. And because it's a check where they just roll their strength stat pure versus your spellcasting stat, chances are they won't have any major modifiers to the roll like they will with a saving throw. So if you're facing off against a spellcaster who has a super dangerous item in their hands, chances are they might have a low strength score, so it'd be really easy to just take it from their hands with an ability contest, which might even win you the encounter because they can't do anything threatening to you without the super powerful weapon you just took away from them. And by using this spell to restrain, you're also able to grant advantage on one target, which can be really good. And this is why boss monsters have legendary resistances, to kind of brush off all the other more deadly control spells in the game. But telekinesis is one of the few that actually gets around this distinction, so it is useful in combat, while also being incredibly versatile outside of it too. And at number 6, we have Scrying. This is a spell that basically lets you spy on anyone you vaguely know. You don't even have to have met the person you're trying to spy on. As long as you simply have second-hand knowledge of the target, i.e. you may have heard of them before, then you can use Scrying in order to spy on them for 10 minutes. That's pretty much all the spell does. It creates like an invisible eyeball that allows you to see and hear them for 10 minutes, which they can't see unless they're able to see invisible creatures. The ability to spy on anyone you might have vaguely known about is kind of powerful as an information tool, and can sometimes be used in order to solve major plot points in a campaign. To the point where Scrying is kind of one of those spells that DMs absolutely loathe, because it allows players to solve some problems way too easily. It's also something players hate whenever a DM uses it on them, because it definitely makes it hard for them to actually run away or sneak up on a bad guy. However, the target of your spying does have a chance to succeed the saving throw in order to not be spied on for 24 hours. And they get a bonus to their saving throw based on how well you know the target. Where if you try to spy on someone that you've only heard about secondhand, they get a +5 bonus. However, if you have a piece of the target that you're trying to spy on, i.e. a body part, lock of hair, a bit of nail, or something similar, then they have a -10 to their saving throw. And there's a couple of other modifiers based on other things, like how as long as you've at least met the target face to face at least once, then they don't get any bonus to the saving throw in order to not be spied on. There is one limiting factor to Scrying though, and that is you need an object worth at least 1,000 gold in order to use the spell, which might make it so you can't actually use Scrying, so it's all dependent on your campaign and your DM, because that is kinda pricey. Now, the usefulness of being able to spy on anyone whenever you want, as long as they're on the same plane of existence as you, is incredibly dependent on what kind of game you're playing too, but is still just really useful anyway, so it's definitely an excellent 5th level spell. And at number 5, we have Reincarnate/Raise Dead. These are 2 5th level spells that allow you to bring someone back to life if they died within the last 10 days. Raise Dead is a little bit more straightforward, in that as long as their body is intact somewhat, it will bring them back to life, close all their wounds, and also cure non-magical diseases and poisons. Then they take a -4 penalty to all their attack rolls, saving throws, and ability checks, where the penalty is reduced by 1 every time they finish a long rest. So they come back to life, but with a lesser power level for a few days. However, if they're missing a body part, which might make it so they would die immediately if they're brought back to life, like they're missing their head for example, then the spell doesn't work. It also costs 500 gold in order to cast because of its material cost. Reincarnate is even more expensive as it costs 1,000 gold to cast. However, it avoids a lot of the pitfalls of Raise Dead, as it just creates a brand new body for the soul to inhabit. But it doesn't let you choose the body, as the DM rolls a D100 and then chooses a new race based on the table given in the spell. The table is basically just all the races from the player's handbook, so no chance of being turned into a giant frog or something else detrimental. Reincarnate also does not require you to have the full body of the creature you're trying to bring back to life, just a part of it. So depending on how the creature died, when trying to bring them back to life, both of these spells can be useful, and generally, having the option to resurrect is just insanely useful in the average game. It doesn't matter what kind of campaign you're running. And having a larger window where you can bring people back to life within 10 days is basically the benefits of these 5th level spells, compared to the lower level spells that can bring people back to life too, as Revivify can only bring someone back to life who's been dead less than 1 minute. And at number 4, we have Circle of Power. This is a paladin-only spell which basically grants all allies within 30 feet magical resistance, where they have advantage on saving throws against magical effects, plus the effect that they take no damage if they succeed a saving throw, which would usually cause half damage on a success. Giving everyone in your party magical resistance as long as they're within 30 feet of you is a super good benefit to have, especially the fantastic effect of not taking damage if they succeed their saves. This extra effect is really rare. Off the top of my head, I can only think of a handful of subclasses that gain the ability to take no damage on a success, and usually only against a single type of saving throw. The effect is so good that it'd be kind of overpowered if you can get it at 9th level, as it would completely counter any spellcasters you might go against, which is why it's only available to paladins once they reach 17th level and gain access to their 5th level spells. So if you're playing a class that can get other classes' spells at earlier levels, again bards with magical secrets, this is an excellent defensive ability to steal. One of the reasons Satyrs and Yuan-Ti Purebloods are really good races to pick is because they have the magical resistance as one of their racial traits. And pretty much every boss has the magical resistance trait too in order to have advantage on saving throws against magical effects. So being able to grant this to everyone in your party during any fight, but especially during boss fights, would just be one of the best ways to protect everyone in the party, just as long as they stick close enough to you. And at number 3, we have Greater Restoration. This spell basically just allows you to dispel a lot of common, but very deadly debuffs. Generally, whenever a monster inflicts a really nasty debuff to a target, there's always a little addition in the fact that says it can't be removed, except by the Greater Restoration spell or a higher level spells like Wish. And because there are so many effects like this in the game, it's almost necessary for at least one person in the party to pick it up, or to know an NPC who can use the ability, because it also just removes a whole bunch of other stat-lowering abilities and some common forms of CC, like the Charm effect or the more deadly Petrified condition. They can also be used to remove one level of exhaustion. However, you probably don't want to waste it on exhaustion unless you really need to, because it does use a 5th level spell slot, which is kind of precious on its own, but also uses 100 gold worth of diamond dust every time you use the spell, and that adds up pretty fast. And at number 2, we have Animate Objects. This spell basically allows you to animate a whole bunch of inanimate objects in order to move them around and have them attack for you. By default, this allows you to animate 10 objects, but you can animate a smaller amount of bigger objects instead, like using 8 of its charges to animate a huge statue to fight for you, and then using the remaining 2 in order to animate 2 coins in your pocket. And then there's tables in the spell itself, which determines how much damage the objects do. But what's really good about this spell is that if you use it on 10 silver coins, you have the hardest hitting 5th level single target spell, as if all the coins land their attacks, it deals 65 damage on average, which is slightly less than double the single target damage of Cone of Cold. And all the tiny coins have a +8 to their hit, which is a pretty high attack modifier, so chances are most of them are actually going to land their attacks. And this spell gives the animated objects a fly speed and allows them to hover, which makes them very maneuverable. And if you use silver coins, they can be treated as silvered attacks for creatures that silver is effective against. It should be really easy to always carry around 10 coins with you in order to use the spell effectively, especially since you get to keep them animated for a minute. And all it takes is a bonus action in order to command them to attack whatever you're fighting, and that's about it. Outside of using it as a high burst of single target damage, it can also be useful in order to just animate a large statue in a dungeon in order to help you move stuff out of the way or check for traps. But the main use of animate objects is definitely in combat. It even made it into my video on the top 10 spells that deal the most amount of damage, as the potential damage of animate objects was even higher than some 7th level spells that deal pure single target damage. However, the one big downside to this is how annoying it is to control so many creatures in an actual fight, where even though the damage is really good, a lot of tables might not want to deal with all the rolls that are required in order to resolve 10 coins attacking something. And at number 1, we have Wall of Force. Wall of Force creates an invisible wall at a point within 120 feet of you, which can be at any angle you want. It can be free floating or resting against a solid surface, or you can form it into a spherical dome or just a sphere, with a radius of up to 10 feet. If you shape it, it has a flat surface, it's made up of 10 10-foot by 10-foot panels, and the panels must be touching at least one other panel. The wall itself is immune to all damage, and nothing can physically pass through the wall. It can't be dispelled with Dispel Magic, it extends into the ethereal plane, but it can be destroyed instantly with the Disintegrate spell. So, once the wall is out, it's basically staying there until your concentration drops or its 10-minute duration ends. And what's really good about the Wall of Force is that you can use it in order to trap a bad guy with its dome feature, where unless they have a way to teleport outside of it, there's nothing they can do until you drop your concentration or it ends its duration. So going into a final boss fight where there's one boss that can fit within a 10-foot radius dome, and he has a whole bunch of minions, you can kind of just completely counter them by just putting him in a Wall of Force. Deal with all of his minions, then attack him all at once you drop your concentration on the Wall of Force, using a whole bunch of readied actions. There's no saving throw for being trapped with the Wall of Force, which is the big benefit of the spell, as it kind of just works for a whole bunch of different kinds of encounters. If you're in a small dungeon with a whole bunch of narrow corridors, and there's a horde of enemies barreling down on you, you can just block them and ignore them, because they can't break through the wall, and will be up for 10 minutes. Wall of Force is so powerful it just breaks all kinds of encounters, especially at 9th level where teleports aren't commonplace yet. In fact, there's tons of monsters in the monster manual that can't teleport at all. And if you cast something like Sickening Radiance on a boss first, and then trap them inside of the Wall of Force, it's basically an instant win combo, as the boss will eventually fail enough saving throws to die from exhaustion, assuming the damage doesn't get him first. So because Wall of Force is one of those spells that's kind of overpowered, can break the game on occasion, and is loathed by DMs like Scrying, it's the best 5th level spell in the game. Most spellcasters gain the ability to cast 6th level spells at level 11. So in this list, we'll be going over 10 of the best 6th level spells you might be able to pick up once you get there. Starting off at number 10, we have Otiluke's Freezing Sphere. This spell is just a huge AoE with a 60-foot radius that deals 10d6 cold damage to all targets that fail a Constitution saving throw, taking half as much on a success. As this spell has a 300-foot range, you can throw this very far away in order to make sure it doesn't hit you or any of your allies. Because if you use this thing anywhere near the battlefield, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have some friendly fire, due to its 60-foot radius, which is gigantic. It's literally 3 times as big as a fireball. Although it does deal less damage than a fireball if you simply upcast it to 6th level. But you're giving up a little bit of damage on this thing in order to just have a massive range and radius. Some other niche uses of Freezing Sphere is it can also freeze bodies of water, so you can throw it into a lake in order to freeze a large amount of it, or even use it to freeze a river so you can just walk across. The ice lasts for 1 minute and even traps creatures that were in the water when it got frozen, requiring them to make a strength check in order to break free. You could also choose not to fire the ability and just keep it as a small globe the size of a sling bullet, where at any time you or a creature that you give the globe to can throw it for the full effect. Or you can even launch it with a sling to have a longer range, since if you throw it as a globe, it only has a maximum range of 40 feet, where it explodes and has the same exact effect as if you casted it normally. You can also set down the globe and have it shatter itself after 1 minute, so you can set up a trap with it if you so choose. Another thing you can do is, if you have the 9th level spell Time Stop, you can actually create multiple Freezing Spheres during the Time Stop, as it's one of the few ways to prepare extra damage during a Time Stop because it doesn't require concentration. You can also just hand the globes off to friendly party members who can throw them as well. Now, there is another spell with the same radius called Circle of Death, where it deals the exact same damage as the 3rd level spell Fireball at 86, but with a 60-foot radius. However, with only a 150-foot range instead of the 300 feet that Otiluke's Freezing Sphere has. But Circle of Death is necrotic damage, which is not as resisted as cold damage. However, they both target Constitution saves, which are typically pretty bad saves to target, because most monsters have a high Constitution score. So if you're just looking for a wide radius blast spell that doesn't require too much complicated thinking or concentrations, Otiluke's Freezing Sphere and Circle of Death are kind of the 2 options available at 6th level. And at number 9, we have Globe of Invulnerability. This spell creates a 10-foot radius sphere around you where you and anyone else inside of it are immune to 5th level or lower spells from outside the barrier. However, you can cast spells inside the barrier as much as you want, including to attack other creatures. So the main benefit of Globe of Invulnerability, since it does require a full action and your concentration to keep it up, is if you really don't want to be counterspelled. Because one of the little niches of Globe of Invulnerability is the fact that it doesn't matter if the spell is upcast or not, it only counts the spell's base level. So even if an enemy creature casts counterspell at the 6th level, to bypass the 5th level limit, you're still immune to it because it was originally a 3rd level spell. It also protects you from AoE effects, so if someone tries to throw a fireball at you, you're just straight up immune to it. Being able to become immune to spells is pretty great. The problem is there aren't a lot of spellcasters in the game casting spells on players, and technically a dragon's flame breath is not counted as a spell, so it will hit you through a Globe of Invulnerability no problem. And also, this spell does require a full action to cast as well as your concentration to keep up, so you really have to give up your first round of combat in order to gain its effects. And the spell itself can be counterspelled anyway, so there's a chance you won't even be able to get it up if you're trying to not be counterspelled. There is a way to mitigate this a bit, however, due to the range of counterspell, as it has a range of 60 feet, so if you cast this and then let the enemies come to you, it could still help you out. This brings us to the second issue with this spell, in that creatures can just kind of walk into the globe. So if they want to beat you up in melee, they can. Also, Globe of Invulnerability can be dispelled with Dispel Magic, even though it's a 3rd level spell. And that's because the target is the Globe of Invulnerability itself, and not something inside the globe. Now, there is another pretty good defensive spell that was also added recently called Fizzbang's Platinum Shield, which doesn't give you immunity to magic like Globe of Invulnerability, but only requires a bonus action to cast, and it lets you grant a friendly target a +2 to their AC, resistance to 5 common damage types, and evasion, where you take no damage if you succeed a dexterity save from a spell or effect which would normally take half damage. You can move this shield around to another target with subsequent bonus actions as long as you keep your concentration up. So when it comes to protecting yourself with 6th level spells, these 2 spells do a pretty good job. But there is one at a higher spot on this list that is just a little bit better. And at number 8, we have Chain Lightning. This is a spell which can hit a total of 4 targets, 1 creature of your choice within 150 feet, as well as 3 others that are within 30 feet of the first target. A Chain Lightning deals an average of 45 damage to each target. Now, when you compare this with single target spells, if you look at 5th level, we have Animate Objects, which deals an average of 65 damage to 1 target in 1 turn. So, from a single target point of view, it's definitely not as good as a spell of a lower level, or even other spells at the same level, as Disintegrate deals 75 damage on average to a single target, and Harm deals 49 damage, and even Summon Fiend deals 48 damage if all 3 of its multi-attacks hit. Although, Chain Lightning is not single target damage, it bounces to 3 other targets for full damage. So, if you're able to hit 4 targets with Chain Lightning, that's 180 damage on average. Now, if you just hit a whole bunch of creatures with either Otoluk's Freezing Sphere or Circle of Death, you're going to deal way more than 180 damage. However, this is where the main benefit of Chain Lightning comes in, and that's the fact that you can fire it into the middle of your martial characters and not hit a single one of them, while hitting 4 targets of your choice. It's one of the few AoE spells that has built-in friendly fire protection, and it deals a lot of damage to those 4 targets. And even if you simply hit 2 targets, you beat all of the single target spells in damage at this level, which don't last over multiple turns. Because technically Sunbeam can use its effect 10 times with 1 spell slot, as it hits all creatures within a 60-foot line and deals 27 damage on average to each target. So, eventually, 1 casting of Sunbeam can beat the damage of Chain Lightning as well, but Sunbeam doesn't have friendly fire protection either. So, while you may technically be able to do more damage with one of the other AoE spells by hitting a whole bunch more targets, and you can technically hit harder with some of the single target spells if you're fighting a single target, a lot of combat encounters don't really have massive amounts of enemies anyway. So you might be hitting all of your opponents with 1 casting of a Chain Lightning, and getting the maximum amount of damage from those 4 targets hit. So the usefulness of the spell is dependent on your campaign and what creatures you're fighting, but in pretty much every game that I've ran, Chain Lightning would be able to hit around half of the creatures in a standard combat encounter, whereas the other AoE spells that can hit all of them would also be hitting the rest of your party as well. And at number 7, we have Hero's Feast. This is a really expensive spell to cast, as it consumes 1,000 gold pieces in materials each time you use it. However, when used, it allows 12 people to spend an hour eating the food it conjures, which cures them of all diseases and poisons, and makes them immune to poison and being frightened for 24 hours. As well as giving them advantage in all their wisdom saving throws during the same duration. And lastly, it increases their maximum hit points by 2d10, also healing them for the same amount. Now, what's really great about this ability is that it lasts for 24 hours, so technically, you could use this at the end of the day with a spare spell slot and carry the benefits over into the next day, just having a passive immunity to poison in the frightened condition, which are 2 things that come up a lot when fighting against average monsters, as well as having advantage in all wisdom saves, which is even better, as wisdom saves are often the most important ones to succeed, as failure typically results in a lost control effect instead of pure damage like a dexterity save does. And the maximum hit point increase you gain stacks with other maximum hit points increases, like Aid, as well as temporary hit points, since it technically doesn't count as temp HP. So, if you're looking for an excellent buff to give your whole party, and you have more gold than you know what to do with, casting Hero's Feast at the end of every night with a spare 6th level spell slot is going to give you the most bang for your buck. And at number 6, we have Heal. This is a healing spell which is only available to clerics and druids, and all it does is use your action in order to cause 1 target to regain 70 hit points, as well as remove 3 minor status debuffs. When it comes to a healing spell that is just very efficient for its spell level, Heal is definitely one of the best, and is going to be very useful for getting a party member to full health around the 11th level when you can first take this spell, and even a significant amount of health at higher levels in later tiers of play. The status debuffs it cures aren't super common or very important, but it is a nice little bit of icing on the cake, although you will still need greater restoration in order to remove all the more nasty effects. And at number 5, we have Oto's Irresistible Dance. This is a spell that when cast on a target causes them to start dancing in place, where during their turn they have to use all of their movement to dance in place, and it also gives them disadvantage on dexterity saves and all of their attack rolls, and more importantly, making it so that all attack rolls against them are done at advantage. And if the creature wants to end the effect on themselves, they have to wait until their turn, where they have to use an action in order to perform a wisdom saving throw, ending the effect on a success. Now, you may be thinking that just basically applying the restrained condition to a target is not worth a 6th level spell slot, especially since the target still gains their actions and doesn't actually stop them from anything other than moving. However, one of the things to note about this spell is the fact that there's no saving throw for applying this spell in the first place. Unless the target is immune to being charmed, they're affected by the spell as soon as it's cast on them, so it bypasses a boss monster's legendary resistances. That's the power of this spell, being able to place a debuff on a target which gives you advantage to all your party's attacks, without having to worry about a legendary resistance stopping the control effect. And it can even cause them to lose their turn if they choose to use an action in order to end the effect, as they don't gain an automatic try at the end of the turn on damage like most other control spell effects have. And at number 4, we have Mass Suggestion. This is a spell that basically casts the second level spell suggestion spell, but on 12 targets. It doesn't require concentration, and lasts for 24 hours. As long as the creatures can hear and understand you and aren't immune to being charmed, you can give them a command that's 2 sentences or less, which they have to follow as long as it's reasonable and they failed the wisdom saving throw. So, if you tell them all to just kill themselves, then the effect won't take hold. However, if you encounter an enemy group of creatures, and there's 12 or less of them, you can basically instantly win the encounter by just telling them all to go away. You can just tell them to go take a hike, go walk in the other direction, go home, whatever you can think of, because it's real easy to just instantly end an encounter with Mass Suggestion. Especially since you're able to use it on up to 12 targets at once. And if you're creative, you can do even more with those 2 sentences. It works on big creatures as well, so you can convince an entire group of giants to stop attacking a town. So even at the higher levels, it remains useful. Although all the giants would have to be within 60 feet of you when you cast the spell, so positioning would be quite important. Even if you can't hit everyone, immediately eliminating half of an enemy party with Mass Suggestion is pretty good crowd control. And if you want to be more devious with Mass Suggestion, you can increase the duration of the effect by quite a lot by upcasting the spell, where it can last up to 10 days if you upcast at the 7th level, and a year and a day if cast at 9th. And at number 3, we have Eye Bite. This is a spell that lasts for 1 minute, where every turn you get to choose one of the 3 crowd control effects you want to inflict on a target within 60 feet of you. Where you choose a target who must succeed a wisdom saving throw, and on failure, they either fall asleep until they take damage or are shaken awake by someone else, be panicked, where on each of their turns they have to take the dash action to run away from you, or you can sicken the target, which gives them disadvantage on their attacks and ability checks. They get to make another wisdom saving throw at the end of each of their turns in order to end the effect early, but even a single turn of this effect can be devastating. Sicken is not as good as the other 2, because being able to put someone to sleep just completely removes them from the encounter, or allows one of your allies to hit with advantage and an automatic crit if they decide to attack anyway. And if you panic them, you can also attack them while they're running away, and they're not able to break the frightened effect unless they're both able to move more than 60 feet away and out of line of sight of you. So, depending on where you fear a target, they might not be able to meet the conditions to break the effect, and you can just fear them into a corner where they can't do anything, and you can attack them without them being able to use their actions to fight back, as they're forced to use their action to dash. And unlike the other spells that have similar effects, what makes Eye Bite especially good is the fact that you can just keep doing this every turn with a single spell slot. So basically, you get to spend each of your turns trying to control a different target, but you only have to spend a single spell slot to do so, instead of having to cast a whole bunch of other control spells using more spell slots. If a target succeeds a save, you can't target them again unless you recast the spell. But still, the main benefit of Eye Bite is that you just get so much mileage out of one spell slot, even if you're only affecting one target per turn. And at number 2, we have Contingency. This is a spell which has the effect that when you cast it, you can choose one of the other spells you can cast that's 5th level or below, and then create a condition where the spell will be cast instantly, once the condition is met, no matter how vague or specific you are. Although there are some limitations to it, the spell you choose can only be one that requires one action to cast, and it has to be one that can target you. And it also uses both your 6th level spell slot to cast Contingency in addition to the spell slot of the spell that you want the Contingency to cast. It also costs 1,500 gold pieces to cast, but that is not consumed when you use it. So, what makes Contingency really good is the fact that it lasts for 10 days with no concentration. So just like with Hero's Feast, you can just use this on a day where you have a spare 6th level spell slot in order to set it up for later use. For example, you could create the condition that, if you drop below 20 hit points, you cast Otoluk's Resilient Sphere, which is a 4th level spell that basically encases you in a bubble that makes you impervious to harm. Though a Disintegrate spell can crack this bubble, nothing else can get through it. You could also make the condition very simple so that you just activate whatever you want as a free action. Like, if I blink my eyes twice in quick succession, then invisibility is cast on me. Some people also like to use Contingency to let them cast Dimension Door, however, some DMs would require the direction of the Dimension Door to be set when you cast Contingency, making this option not available to all players. Contingency is a spell that really allows you to use your imagination. So, while normally you can't use Otoluk's Resilient Sphere to save yourself, as it requires an action to cast, but it can be used to save yourself with Contingency, as it's just a simple condition. You can get really specific with it if you want, and have something like, if I cast Counterspell in reaction to a spell targeting me, and that Counterspell fails, and the spell targeting me has a lingering effect on me, then cast Dispel Magic. And since the effect lasts for 10 days, you will eventually have a day where you have a spare 6th level spell slot. So once you have Contingency, chances are you're always going to have one of them active. And at number 1, we have Mental Prison. This is basically a single target damaging ability which has the highest amount of potential single target damage of any spell until 9th level, where only Meteor Swarm beats it in single target damage. Even beating out 7th level spells, like Finger of Death or Delayed Blast Fireball that has been fully charged. As what this spell does is one target within 60 feet that's not immune to being charmed has to succeed an intelligence saving throw, where if they fail, they take 5d10 psychic damage, and they are immediately surrounded in an illusion that can be whatever you want. But whatever the illusion is, the target can't see or hear anything beyond it. And if the target moves out of the illusion, attacks it, or reaches any body part through it, they immediately take an additional 10d10 psychic damage and the spell ends. However, if they succeed the original saving throw, they still take 5d10 psychic damage and then the spell ends with no illusion. So, if they fail and then walk through the illusion, they take 15d10 psychic damage, or around 83 damage on average, which is 8 more damage than the Disintegrate spell, and 21 more damage than Finger of Death, which is a 7th level single target blast spell. One of the main benefits of Mental Prison over some of the other harder hitting high level single target spells is that it actually deals damage on a failed save, whereas Disintegrate simply fizzles out and does nothing. It also targets an excellent saving throw with Intelligence, which a vast majority of creatures in the monster manual are lacking in. Really, the only point against Mental Prison is the fact that it doesn't work on creatures who are immune to being charmed, which a lot of boss monsters sadly are. But still, if you land a Mental Prison on something, chances are they're going to fail the saving throw and then take a ton of damage, unless they have legendary resistances to auto-succeed. But they will still take 28 damage on average from the initial 5d10, which is about the damage that a fireball deals to a single target. Now, a single target damaging ability probably isn't better than Contingency, Eye Bite, or even Mass Suggestion, which can completely end an encounter. But it is the hardest hitting single target spell into the 9th level, and a lot of people like to just do damage with their spells rather than using the overly complicated control spells, which are technically better. So, when it comes to big single target damage, you can't really beat Mental Prison. 7th level spells are usually available for players once they hit level 13, and this level of spell is chock full of some really powerful stuff, some of which are better than 9th level spells. So this list, we're going to go over some of the best 7th level spells that you can pick up in a game. Starting off at number 10, we have Crown of Stars, as well as some other damaging spells. Crown of Stars is an ability which creates 7 motes of light that circle your head, where you can use a bonus action in order to launch one as a ranged spell attack that deals 4d12 radiant damage, so around 26 damage on average. So when you finally use up all 7 charges, it deals around 182 damage, which is a pretty respectable amount for a single spell slot. And what makes this spell particularly useful when compared to other single target damaging spells which deal more damage is the fact that the spell lasts for a full hour and doesn't require concentration. Which means you can just use this at the start of a dungeon to ensure that you'll be able to actually use all 7 charges to get the full mileage out of the 7th level spell slot. And you can also use it during a time stop since it doesn't require concentration and is a pretty beneficial buff to have on you, i.e. the ability to have a pretty hard-hitting bonus action attack every turn. Remember, activating the effects of a spell with your bonus action does not conflict with the bonus action rule of spellcasting, so you can use a charge of Crown of Stars with your bonus action every turn, and still cast other leveled spells with your action. And when it comes to the damage of other spells at the 7th level, they're all pretty lackluster for the most part. If you just wanted something to deal pure damage like Fireball, there is also Delayed Blast Fireball, which allows you to charge the spell for a full minute in order to deal a potential 22d6 fire damage, or around 77 damage on average to every target. This is more damage than a Finger of Death to every target within a fireball radius. And even if you don't charge the full duration, it still deals as much damage as a fireball upcasted to 7th level, so you're not really losing out on any damage, because casting a fireball to 7th level kind of outdamages the only AoE spells at this level anyway. Or just Delayed Blast Fireball, since it's basically the same thing if you're not charging it up. Lastly, there's also Divine Word, which is kind of like a power word kill for low health targets, where it has an effect depending on the target's current hit points, and one of them is all creatures within 30 feet of you when you use Divine Word that have less than 20 health are instantly killed, if they fail a charisma save of course. And you can also choose any number of creatures you want, so it's perfectly safe from friendly fire. If creatures have less than 50 hit points, they become deafened for 1 minute. If they have less than 40 hit points, they're deafened and blinded for 10 minutes. And if they have less than 30 hit points, they're deafened, blinded, and stunned for 1 hour. and the last step being instant death for a creature under 20 hit points. Also, if it's against otherworldly creatures like celestials or fiends, then it basically acts as a better banishment, as if they fail the saving throw, they're forced back to their plane of origin and can't return for 24 hours. And just remember that the average orc only has 15 health, so Divine Word just kind of deletes a small army of orcs or other similar low-level creatures, and these are probably the best spells when it comes to just dealing damage at this level, as everything else is tied to some kind of special effect that significantly lowers its damage, like Whirlwind or Firestorm, or it just takes way too long to set up for being reliably used in combat like Symbol. And at number 9, we have Mirage Arcane. This is a really unique spell which basically allows you to create illusionary terrain in a 1 mile square to look like almost whatever you want, with the bonuses that this new terrain you create is realistic to the touch, as well as giving off all the other effects that are required in order to make it feel real. So if you want, you could create a forest in the middle of a field and actually be able to climb on the trees. However, if you created a field full of fruit-bearing trees, as soon as you remove anything from the terrain, it immediately disappears. You can also create an entire city out of nothing, and be able to actually climb on top of the buildings, but not remove anything from any of the buildings, as it has a whole bunch of other limitations to it, like not allowing you to do anything that relates to creatures or even trap them and stuff with its very realistic illusions. But Mirage Arcane is kind of the closest thing you can get to a reality warping illusion. And since it is technically an illusion, someone with true sight is able to realize that it's an illusion, but they can still interact with it as if it was real. So it's one of the few illusions that doesn't just go away once it's recognized. And it is possible to hurt people with the illusion, but only if you're really smart about it or find a way to drown them, as you are able to change the terrain in a way where they might fall off of a large cliff, or make it so that they're submerged in water where they can't get out, just as long as you don't create an object around them, as that's kind of a no-go with the limitations of the spell. And also, there's lots of contention online about whether or not you're able to just spawn a lava pit underneath people, as when people ask sage advice about this particular interaction, the confirmation just kind of avoided the question and instead just confirmed that drowning and falling was okay. So you can't really use Mirage Arcane to deal damage unless you're really clever about getting your targets to fall off of large cliffs. So one of the useful things you can do with this is turn a 1 mile square into difficult terrain, like maybe a nice grassy plain into a swamp, and then make other people walk across it too because the spell will last for 10 days. Or to create a whole bunch of difficult terrain outside of a city in order to impede an invading army, or to just create a portable city that you can interact with for 10 days. Just as long as you don't pick up any of the items inside of it. The spell does take 10 minutes to cast, so it's not like you can set it up in an emergency, unless you use a wish in order to cast the spell instantly, in which case you totally can create an entire forest out of nothing. So, if you ever wanted a Doctor Strange reality warping effect that changes the environment, this is basically what you get with Mirage Arcane, and it would be higher on this list if it could deal direct damage to people, or at the very least trap creatures in some way. And at number 8, we have Reverse Gravity. This is a spell which allows you to choose a 50-foot radius space within 100 feet of you, where everything inside of it just falls 100 feet into the air. That is, unless they're able to succeed a dexterity saving throw in order to grab onto something nearby, which really could be anything. And also, if a creature would hit a ceiling before they reach the full 100 feet, they take damage as if they'd fallen into it, and fall damage is 1d6 for every 10 feet fallen. So if you're in a building that's 100 feet high, theoretically you could make everyone fall into the ceiling and take 10d6 damage, and then end your concentration and make them fall back down in order to take another 10d6 damage, which would average of 70 damage to every creature, making this the hardest hitting AoE ability at this level, but only in ideal conditions. However, there are cases to be made that a creature wouldn't fall the full 100 feet because you factor in the height of their character, and of course it's difficult to find buildings that are exactly 100 feet high. So, best case scenario, you lift everyone up 100 feet off the ground and then drop them 100 feet, which is only 10d6 damage to each, or 35 damage on average, which is the average damage of a fireball upcasted to 5th level. Which, while not half bad for damage, it is kind of low for a 7th level spell. But Reverse Gravity has a 50-foot radius, which is more than twice the radius of fireball, and also a lot of other combo potential as well. Like if someone creates a prismatic wall sphere above an enemy group, and you force all of them to fall into it. And remember, the creatures who take fall damage are considered prone, so it's technically an area-wide crowd control effect as well. However, the damage is about the same as Prismatic Spray, another 7th level spell, which is not on this list because its damage is kind of low for a 7th level spell. However, there is the point that creatures who are affected by Reverse Gravity are just kind of stuck in the air for the duration. And a lot of creatures in the monster manual don't even have ranged attacks, so you could just pick them off in the air before they fall that 100 feet with some of your ranged attacks. And it even works on larger sized creatures as there's no weight limit, plus objects are affected by the spell as well. And at number 7, we have Regenerate. This is a spell which takes 1 minute to cast, and upon completion will heal a target for around 33 hit points on average, and then give them a buff for 1 hour, which causes them to heal for an additional 1 hit point at the start of each of their turns, or 600 hit points over the course of 1 hour. It also has some other RP benefits where it regrows severed limbs, which is perfectly appropriate for a 7th level spell. However, this will likely never come up as dismemberment rules are very rare. An interesting thing to note about regeneration from the spell as opposed to regeneration from monsters is that it does activate if you start your turn at 0 hit points, and it doesn't turn off by being hit by some kind of certain type of damage. So, if you cast Regenerate before combat starts, and you go down to 0 hit points, instead of rolling death saving throws during your turn, you just get back into the battle with 1 hit point. And since 5th edition does not have built-in negative penalties for dropping to 0 or negative hit points, you just basically can't go unconscious as long as you have Regenerate cast on you. And it doesn't have a concentration requirement either, so you don't have to worry about losing it mid-fight. The only way to really stop someone that has Regenerate on them is to either dispel them, or just straight up kill them so they can't get back up, which means attacking them after they go down and forcing 3 death saving throws. And that's really the biggest benefit of Regenerate. Just casting this on your frontline fighter before a big fight starts allows you to just kind of ignore healing them because they're going to keep coming back into the battle at the start of their turn anyway, just as long as they aren't killed outright. There are also some other things you can do for roleplay flavor of regeneration, like being able to heal crippled body parts by cutting it off first and then regrowing the brand new limb, or just making all kinds of money by regrowing limbs in a major city. Basically, once your character has the ability to cast Regenerate, they're kind of set for life, since the ability doesn't cost any expensive material components to use either. Just a very valuable 7th level spell slot. And at number 6, we have Etherealness. This spell basically allows you to enter the ethereal realm for 8 hours, or until you use another action in order to just go back to the material. Now, the benefits of being able to go into the ethereal for up to 8 hours is the fact that you are able to see in the material while you're in the ethereal, just as long as you're within 60 feet of whatever you want to see. But creatures in the material realm aren't able to see you unless they have something that lets them see specifically into the ethereal realm, like True Sight. And also, you're able to basically walk through walls, objects, or creatures unless they specifically extend into the ethereal, which most don't. So etherealness is basically like a super invisibility, and works basically how people believe normal invisibility works, where no one can see you, but you can see them and do whatever you want. It also lasts for a full 8 hours, so with one cast of etherealness, you can basically spy on anyone you want for a full day, and there's a good chance they won't know that you're doing it. Although I'm not sure if you're able to hear them, but you can at least see them with no problem, so long as you remain within 60 feet of them. And of course, the best use of this spell is the ability to just get away from any situation you want, since not only does it basically make you invisible to everything, but it makes it so you can't be affected by anything either. And if you upcast a spell at a higher spell slot, you're able to take other people with you, although not very many. But if you want to use a 7th level spell slot in order to get your entire party out of danger, you might want to hold off for one of the higher spots on this list. And at number 5, we have Draconic Transformation. This is a spell that basically turns into a half dragon for a minute and gives you all kinds of very useful benefits, including a bonus action breath weapon that actually deals a pretty decent 68 force damage, or 27 damage on average in a 60-foot cone. In addition to giving you a bonus action breath weapon every turn, it also gives you a blind sight out of range to 30 feet, which allows you to see invisible targets unless they specifically hide from you, and it gives you spectral wings which give you a fly speed of 60 feet. Granting a temporary flight speed and blind sight are both really good benefits, but not quite worth a 7th level spell slot. The fact that this spell is a bonus action to cast and allows you to use the breath weapon immediately is what allows it to be one of the better 7th level spells. The damage is not going to be higher than just using one of the other AoE spells at this level, where Prismatic Spray deals around 35 damage on average to each target hit by its cone. However, you get to use the bonus action cone every turn for a full minute. So, using your bonus action breath just 2 times allows it to be the average damage of Prismatic Spray, and both of them having the same cone radius of 60 feet, so you'd be hitting the same number of targets. While Prismatic Spray is a one and done spell, you also get really good bonuses on top of it, including 60 feet of flying speed, which can allow you to outrange all monsters that don't have any ranged attacks immediately, and then just rain force fire down upon them. And the thematic nature of the spell is pretty cool too, which is just an added bonus on top of everything else. When this spell was originally released as an Unearthed Arcana to playtest, a lot of people thought this was going to be the worst 7th level spell of the game, because the breath weapon dealt half the amount of damage and had half the radius, and it only provided 40 feet of fly speed instead of 60. But when they released it officially in Fizzband's Treasury of Dragons, thankfully they buffed it to what it is today, by increasing the fly speed by 20 feet and doubling the damage and length of the breath weapon. And at number 4, we have Plane Shift. This is a spell that lets you travel to other planes, although some restrictions do apply. You're able to travel to pretty much anything you've vaguely heard of before, so you need not have been there previously in order to plane shift. And this spell is smart enough to transport you to a somewhat safe location when you use it. And you're able to bring up to 8 other willing creatures with you, just as long as they're all holding hands in a circle when you use the spell. Additionally, you can perform a melee spell attack on an enemy target in order to banish someone else to a different location, as long as they fail a charisma saving throw. So there are 2 failure states when it comes to trying to banish someone with a spell, first with the attack roll missing, and second with them succeeding the saving throw. But it is still technically an option that could be beneficial, but most of the time you're just using this as a teleport. Because as long as you have 2 7th level spell slots, you can just use plane shift twice in order to teleport anywhere you want on your plane. You just use it once to teleport to a plane of your choice, then use it a second time to teleport back to your plane and just choose the place you want to shift to. So once you get plane shift, the world really opens up, and it kinda breaks the game, because you can technically explore anywhere you want in other planes, and I can guarantee you the DM is probably not going to have everything planned out, in case you try to take a trip over to the 9 Hells. So at 7th level, you literally have the ability to now travel between planes. This really helps illustrate just how powerful the spells are when you get to the higher levels, and why spells like Regeneration, that allow you to come back into combat every turn from 0 hit points, are perfectly on point at this level, as your other spell options are like this one that allows you to explore the cosmos. And at number 3, we have Teleport. Similar to plane shift, Teleport basically makes it so you no longer have to travel if you want to get around, and every game just turns into a loading screen, where if you want to go to a location, you just teleport there. There are some restrictions though, as the place you teleport to needs to be one on the same plane as you, and you have to at least kind of know where you're going. There is a chance of failure for the teleportation based on a whole bunch of factors listed in the spell, but basically, as long as you have an object from the place you're teleporting to, or know the teleportation circle, you should be able to get there no problem. And even if you don't know the place, you can still teleport somewhere that you vaguely know of, just with a slim chance of failure. And teleportation doesn't require you to link hands and is also instant cast. So it's an emergency escape that can be used at any encounter, so it's better than plane shift, which requires everybody to be linking hands in order to perform the shift. Whereas teleport allows you to move up to 8 willing creatures just as long as they're within 10 feet of you, no need to link hands. Which is still a really small area for the teleport, but easier to accomplish than a plane shift, at least in combat. So with spells like Etherealness, plane shift, and teleport available at 7th level, this is kind of the point in the campaign where you no longer really worry about a full party wipe as long as one of your spellcasters with these spells is still alive. And of these escape spells, teleport is the easiest to use, while also just being useful outside of just escaping combat. And at number 2, we have Simulacrum. This is a rather expensive spell to cast, as it does cost 1,500 gold worth of materials plus some other things, and it takes 12 hours to cast, making it one of the longer spells to cast in D&D. But basically, it gives you a duplicate of yourself, or of a beast or humanoid that's within range for the entire casting of the spell. And this duplicate creature has all of the same stats as the original, just with some restrictions. The Simulacrum can't learn anything, it can't restore spell slots, and it's incredibly expensive to heal, as it costs 100 gold worth of rare herbs and other materials in order to regain a single hit point, where it might actually be cheaper to just cast it again to get a new Simulacrum rather than repair an existing one, as you can only control one Simulacrum, but they last until dispelled or until they die. Now, what's useful about Simulacrum? Well, making a copy of yourself effectively doubles your spell slots and doubles your action economy in combat, which kind of makes Simulacrum one of the best spells in the game. So a lot of veteran players might actually be wondering why this is only at number 2 on this list, and not number 1. And that's because, practically speaking, it requires a lot of setup to make the most use out of it, and the Simulacrum can just be focused down in order to get rid of it by enemies, where you can't realistically make another one unless you spend like a full day creating one. It is really good, but it requires a lot of prep to use beforehand, and isn't really something you can just whip out in a combat encounter. But if you do have the prep time beforehand, it's one of the best spells you can cast before a combat encounter, as having double the action economy is just kind of game-breakingly good, and the only downside to it is the fact that it's very hard to heal. So, if a Simulacrum takes any damage, it's a much bigger deal than if a player does. And while the Simulacrum should probably be the number 1 on this list, but because it's easier to use, there is one spell that beats out Simulacrum, as it is also incredibly powerful and is actually usable in combat. And at number 1, we have Force Cage. This is a spell that basically requires all boss monsters to have a teleport ability, otherwise you can instantly beat pretty much any of them, except if they're literally the size of a building. As what it does is, without a saving throw, trap a creature inside of a force cage, which can be 20 foot by 20 foot cage, or a 10 by 10 box, which traps whatever's inside of it without any real way for them to get out of it, unless they can teleport. And if they can teleport, they have to succeed a charisma saving throw against your spell save DC, otherwise it fails. The force cage also extends into the ethereal plane, so you can't even use etherealness to get out of it easily, and also it can't be dispelled by dispel magic. A lot of the other spells on this list can be dispelled with dispel magic, including simulacrum, which makes force cage very hard to get rid of. And force cage lasts for 1 hour, so if you want, you could trap a boss inside of a force cage and then take a short rest outside, in order to attack them with all of your resources and having the initiative being able to prepare a whole bunch of readied actions. However, you can't end the effect early, so if you trap something in a force cage, unless the creature inside of it is able to get out, or you're able to teleport in and then teleport them out, they're kind of stuck there for the full hour duration. And you also can't cast spells into it, but one of the surefire kill combos you can perform with force cage is to simply cast a spell on the target first that stays in an area independent of yourself, and then trap them in a force cage alongside that magical effect. The most common combination is to combo it with Sickening Radiance, as it'll eventually kill them with damage or 6 levels of exhaustion. But you can also use things like Mordenkainen's Faithful Hound, or other similar spells that stay in a fixed location to similar effect. And while the force cage can have bars that are up to ½ an inch wide, you can't escape through them even if you can turn into gas or have some kind of squeezing trait, because the only way to get out of this is through teleporting, even if you can see or squeeze through it. So really, force cage is just an instant win attack that requires no saving throw and can be comboed with a whole bunch of different spells in order to kill anything that's stuck inside of it with that Sickening Radiance. In fact, you kind of have to design high-level encounters around force cage as a DM. Because if you forget that the spell exists, then that big bad evil guy you've been planning a whole campaign around is going to die very quickly, if you forgot to give it a teleport and it's trapped inside the force cage, as no amount of legendary resistances are going to save them for that. And since it's so easy to use, as it just requires an action and has a range of up to 100 feet, it's just infinitely more splashable in a spellcaster's toolkit when compared against Simulacrum with all the prep that's required to use it, though technically it might be better because it gives you double action economy. But one of the good things about having double action economy in other spells is if your Simulacrum has the availability to also use Force Cage, because this spell is probably one of the strongest in the game. Eventually, I'll make a video that goes over all the strongest spells in the game, and I can guarantee you that both Simulacrum and Force Cage will be on that list, beating out a majority of 8th and even 9th level spells in terms of power. 8th level spells are kind of an awkward high level spell, in that they couldn't make the spells of 8th level too strong, otherwise they might overshadow the best spells in the game at 9th level, but they also had to be worth the wait to get at level 15 in order to cast them. So a lot of 8th level spells are a little bit underwhelming, but in this list we're going to go over the best 8th level spells that are definitely worth casting. Starting us off at number 8, we have Abby Dalzim's Horrid Wilting. Despite its incredibly long name, it's actually one of the simplest 8th level spells out there, in that it basically just deals damage within a 30-foot cube area, with extra flavor that it instantly kills plants that aren't creatures, and any plants or water elementals make the save a disadvantage, while constructs and undead aren't affected by it as it's trying to magically suck the moisture out of the area. It deals 12d8 necrotic damage on a failed save, which is more damage than upcast in a fireball at 8th level, which is kind of the threshold you have to beat for an AoE spell to be good at this level range. And this also makes Horrid Wilting the hardest hitting AoE at this level, if all you count is the amount of damage it can deal in a single turn, which is what a lot of people care about when it comes to blast spells. If you want the Fireball of 8th level, it's Horrid Wilting, as Fireball deals 45.5 damage on average when you upcast at 8th level. And Horrid Wilting deals 54 damage on average, easily making it worth being cast with your 8th level spell slot if all you want is big damage. Which is why we're starting off the video with this, because it's the simplest one to evaluate. There is also Sunburst, which occupies the same spot as just being a hard-hitting, instantaneous spell, but it deals 3 less damage on average than an 8th level Fireball, and obviously deals less damage than Horrid Wilting. However, Sunburst has a 60-foot radius, which is literally 3 times as big as Fireball, which is already famous for having a very large radius, and also has the additional effect of blinding creatures it hits for 1 minute. So some people actually consider Sunburst the best spell at 8th level that's the Fireball equivalent, just because it's larger and has an extra blind component. Although for this list, I just go for the pure damage, and Horrid Wilting definitely beats Sunburst on that front. Next up at number 9, we have Incendiary Cloud. This ability is basically an upgraded version of Cloud Kill, as it summons a 20-foot radius sphere of smoke, which heavily obscures everything inside of it, dealing fire damage, 10d8 on a failed saving throw or half as much on a success, to creatures who are either inside of it when it first appears, or enter it for the first time on their turn, and who end their turn inside of it. The spell lasts for a minute, and every turn it moves 10 feet directly away from you in a direction that you choose at the start of each of your turns. The movement is not optional, which is actually kind of a downside of the ability, because it can mean the ability just no longer affects the target of your choice anymore, unless you position yourself in order to move it directly 10 feet back where you want it. Or you have some way to move the target you want to keep inside of it along with the cloud. However, the damage it deals is pretty good. Every turn it deals 45 damage on average to creatures inside of it, which is only half a point less on average than upcasting a fireball to 8th level. And since it lasts for a full minute, you can actually get a lot of mileage out of its damage. There's also another really good concentration spell that deals damage multiple times called Maddening Darkness, which can also cause creatures inside of it to not be able to see things. Although Incendiary Cloud deals more damage, which is basically the only reasons on this list over Maddening Darkness, because Maddening Darkness lasts for 10 minutes instead of just 1 minute, and while it may deal slightly less damage, it has a much larger radius of 60 feet and doesn't move, so it's possible to just trap someone inside of it to take damage for the full duration. And at number 8, we have Anti-Magic Field. This is a spell that surrounds the caster out to a radius of 10 feet, can last for up to 1 hour, and basically makes it so everything inside the radius is immune to magic, and suppresses all magical effects while inside the barrier. And because it basically turns off magic, there's a whole bunch of extra rules and stipulations inside the spell itself in order to try and explain what happens to various magical effects. Anything inside of it is just straight up immune to spells. AoE spells that are cast outside of it just kind of go around the barrier. The barrier itself is immune to being dispelled. If you walk into a magical portal, it temporarily closes. Same with magical creatures temporarily disappearing, as well as magic items losing their effects until they leave the area. And there's even an extra rule that says anti-magic fields don't cancel each other out. So if you have an anti-magic field up, you're just immune to magic, unless someone is able to break your concentration. However, seeing as this is a high-level spell that can only be used by a full caster who gains the ability to cast 8-level spells, and it only has a range of self, the usefulness on a spellcaster is actually pretty slim. In order to get the best use of this, you'd want one of your fighters or other non-magic users with you, in order to have them within your radius and beat up whatever you run into with your anti-magic field. And because it's only usable by high-level spellcasters who are hampered by not being able to cast magic themselves while inside their own field, it is not nearly as overpowered as it could be. Plus, a lot of monsters in the monster manual can't cast spells anyway, so it's not incredibly useful against the average enemy, although it can be incredibly useful in niche situations. Basically, this spell is kind of situational, but the situational effect it has is so good that it just has to make this list, even if there are some other 8th level spells that are just a little bit more useful. And at number 7, we have Dark Star, an ability added with Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, and is only usable by Graviturgist wizards, or unless you ask your DM first. And what this spell does is create a sphere of up to 40 feet, which basically combines the effect of the Silent spell, the Darkness spell, and the other 8th level spell Maddening Darkness, in order to create a void of difficult terrain that deals damage to creatures every turn that they start their turn inside of or enter the field for the first time. Dealing a decent amount of force damage, 45 on average, which is only a half a point less than an 8th level fireball. And since it lasts for 1 minute, you get a lot of mileage with the spell if you're able to keep the creatures inside the Dark Star, which is a lot easier to do because it creates difficult terrain, and doesn't allow creatures to use verbal components, which a lot of teleportation abilities like Misty Step require. Additionally, if a creature dies to the damage inside, they're disintegrated and turned to dust along with all the items they're wearing except for magic items. So this is a pretty strong AoE that lasts for several turns. It has a whole bunch of excellent effects that are amazing for shutting down any creatures inside of it, and also deals competitive damage with Incendiary Cloud, which is a pretty premium damage for the spell level. So you really don't give up anything for having all of these amazing benefits. And, unlike many of the other area of effect spells that last multiple turns, it has a built-in mechanic to keep the creatures inside of it by creating difficult terrain as well. In fact, this spell might be a little bit too good, which could explain why you have to ask your DM before you're allowed to take it. Coming in at number 6, we have Holy Aura. This is a spell that can only be upcast by clerics and grants the effect that all allies within 30 foot radius you have advantage in all saving throws, and all creatures have disadvantage on attacks against those creatures. And in addition, it has a chance to blind fiends and undead that attack any friendly targets affected by the Holy Aura. So basically, it's an AoE buff that gives 2 of the best kinds of protection you can have. Advantage in all your saves, and of course disadvantage in all attacks against you. Having disadvantage in all attacks versus you is amazing. This is equivalent to having a +5 AC, which is the same as having 3/4 cover. This can make it so that your party is almost never hit. And of course, having advantage on your saves is obviously great too, because pretty much every AoE ability has some kind of save component in order to take half damage. So it's just an excellent buff spell that's kind of deserving of a high level spell slot, with the only other spells in this list that have a higher rating are just a little bit more broken or incredibly strong for some other reason. Next up at number 5, we have Glibness. This is a 1 hour buff you can only cast on yourself and is only usable by bards and warlocks, which basically gives you the effect where if you make a charisma check, you can replace the number you roll with a 15. Additionally, if someone would try to determine if you're lying, it always determines that you're telling the truth instead. So, if you're going into a social situation where you have to talk, this is one of the best spells you can cast on yourself beforehand. The ability doesn't require concentration, so you can just use it outside and it will notice that you have magic cast on yourself unless they use some kind of detect magic spell. And since bards and warlocks are both charisma casters, chances are they'll have a 20 in the stat by level 15. So with this spell active, they'll have a minimum roll of 20 every time they perform any of their charisma checks. And of course, they can lie as much as they want without anybody knowing because the buff specifically works on magical effects that might determine if you're telling a lie, to instead determine that you're telling the truth. This spell is honestly kind of overpowered for social situations, because all of your persuasion, deception, and even intimidation checks are going to have incredibly high rolls, since you can't possibly roll lower than a 20, which is usually the DC for a very hard check. Additionally, this does apply to checks for counterspell and dispel magic, so it even has some combat usefulness as well. But definitely the best use of this spell is being the ultimate social situation spell. One that is so good that I'd imagine DM who has to deal with a player that casts Glibness on themselves might secretly just increase the DC of all their checks, so the party doesn't effortlessly blow past whatever they had planned, which could make the spell less useful depending on who your DM is. And at number 4, we have Maze. This is a spell that just straight up, without a saving throw, teleports a creature of your choice within 60 feet to a demiplane, where they have to complete a maze in order to get out. And in order to attempt the maze, they have to make a DC 20 intelligence check, where the DC is set and not based on your spell save DC, in order to attempt to escape. Where if the creature succeeds the check, they're able to get out and reappear the space that they left in, or the nearest unoccupied one. Additionally, this spell has some flavor, where a Minotaur or Goristro demon automatically succeeds the check. The maze can last up to 10 minutes and requires concentration, so you can also end the effect early by just attacking whoever casts the maze and getting them to fail their concentration check. But maze is basically just a hard crowd control that completely ignores saving throws, which is kind of huge when it comes to these kinds of effects. If you use it on a boss, it doesn't matter if they have legendary resistances because it still just sends them into the maze and they have to try to escape like anything else. Although if you do use it on the boss, then no one else can attack it while it's inside the maze, so it's best used on some other kind of supporting creature in order to get them out of the fight, or to just temporarily get rid of the boss so you can take care of its minions. And the creature has to use their action in order to even attempt to get out, so will only have their bonus action and reaction available, which most creatures in the monster manual don't really use. So at the very least you can get rid of the creature's action for a turn, which might or might not be worth an 8th level spell slot depending on how important the creature you trapped is. Maze might be the ultimate crowd control spell that doesn't require a saving throw, because most of them have pretty minor effects, and all of the really powerful crowd control effects require saves before they apply their effects, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in this list, but for not requiring a saving throw, Maze is quite a solid pick. And at number 3, we have Animal Shapes. This spell is only available to druids and has the ability where you can turn any number of willing creatures in 30 feet of you into large or smaller beasts with a challenge rating of 4 or lower. And since there are no beasts of CR4 that fit this distinction, the strongest beast you can turn everyone into is the CR3 Giant Scorpion. Animal Shape lasts for 24 hours, and every turn you can change any of the creatures affected into any other beast you want. If a creature drops to 0 hit points, any extra damage is carried over to their original forms as they untransform, but you can simply use your action to transform them into something else during your next turn. The creatures who are transformed have their stats and abilities replaced with the new creatures, and they can't speak or cast spells unless the beast they turn into can. So, for an 8th level spell that you don't get until level 15, turning everybody into giant scorpions is a downgrade to their base kit. So a lot of people mistakenly assume Animal Shapes is kind of a useless 8th level spell. And if you're using it without any kind of prep, after just reading it for the first time, it can definitely be kind of useless. However, this spell might possibly be one of the most broken spells at this level, if you're able to use it effectively. You see, this spell allows you to transform a creature every turn into a new creature, which means they gain all the hit points of that new creature instantly. So if every turn you just change everybody into a giant scorpion, and then into a cave bear, they'll basically have full health every turn, and your enemy won't be able to take out your party unless they're able to do a full party wipe in a single round, because you can just constantly heal them back into full health by transforming them into a new animal. And the effect lasts for 24 hours, so you almost have unlimited health during the duration. And also, the ability to constantly transform everybody individually means you can use this as the ultimate dungeon exploring tool. You can turn everybody into a spider in order to crawl along the walls or through cracks, then transform everyone to giant scorpions once they reach a room to attack something, or into an ape in order to attack from range. Additionally, animal shapes allows you to target any number of willing creatures that you can see within a 30-foot range. So if, for example, you're preparing to take advantage of this way beforehand, and your DM gives you the okay, you could have a bag full of friendly rats, or any other kind of small vermin or insects, and transform them into giant scorpions in order to have an army of giant scorpions to take down whatever target you sick them on. Now, carrying around a bag of rats in order to transform them into a giant scorpion might make some DMs pretty angry if you just try to spring it on them without explaining what you're trying to do beforehand. But it is technically something you are able to do with the spell, just so long as you're able to ensure that all those creatures are friendly towards you, which is something you can do with a few casting of animal friendships in the days beforehand. You can use it in order to travel faster by turning everybody into birds, and then when you get to your destination, just transform everybody into some other beast or back into the normal forms. You can even turn everybody into giant badgers in order to dig underneath something, since they have a burrow speed. So, if you're very creative with your prep work and using animal shapes, it can be a pretty overpowered spell. If you just use it without prep in the middle of combat, it's kind of underwhelming, as you're turning your powerful party members into CR3 giant scorpions, removing all of their class abilities. Due to all of the setup required in order to make this useful, this only takes the number 3 spot on this list instead of the number 1. And at number 2, we have Dominate Monster. This is one of the best crowd control spells in the game, where if you cast this on a creature within 60 feet of you and it fails the wisdom save, you basically take control of that creature for the hour duration, or until you lose concentration, or the creature eventually breaks out of the spell with its saving throws. Because once you take control of the creature, you can issue them telepathic commands in order to perform general courses of action, like attack that creature over there, or fetch an object for me. And if the creature completes an order and doesn't receive any further directions, it will just defend itself to the best of its abilities, but still be charmed by you and be friendly to you and your party members. Additionally, you could use your action to take precise control over the target, where you can have the creature do whatever you want. And unlike most control spells in the game, Dominate Monster specifically excludes the clause where you can't tell it to hurt itself. So, what's really great about Dominate Monster is that it basically removes an enemy from the battle and gives you an ally to help you in that battle at the same time. So it could be considered a crowd control and summon ability all in one, and both of those things' values are highly dependent on which creatures you cast the spell on, since it's a pure save or suck spell, meaning if the creature succeeds the saving throw, they completely resist the effect and you just lose the spell slot. It's probably not a good idea to cast on a boss monster that has legendary resistances. However, the creature also has a chance to make a new saving throw every time it takes damage, where if they succeed, they can break the effect early. So while you do get a creature that can help fight, if it takes too much damage, it might just break the effect early and then join the battle again. Although if it breaks due to damage, that means it did take some damage and is weaker than it was before while it was fighting on your side, so it's still a net positive as long as it took enough damage. And that's also damage that could have been taken by your other party members, which was taken by the creature instead. Really, there's so many benefits to being able to control one of your opponents that it's no wonder it takes an 8th level spell slot in order to cast it on any creature. And finally, at number 1, we have Illusory Dragon. This ability creates a dragon illusion that looks exactly like a real dragon. If you touch it, it feels like a real dragon, and it's able to breathe a breath weapon just like a real dragon that's able to deal a type of damage based on what kind of dragon you want to look like. And also, when the dragon is summoned, it forces all enemies to perform a wisdom saving throw or be frightened of it for 1 minute. And as a bonus action on each of your turns, you can have it use its breath weapon to move up to 60 feet, where the breath weapon deals 7d6 damage of the chosen type, or about 25 damage on average, slightly less than a 3rd level fireball. However, this dragon also does take up space like a real creature, and even provides cover like a real creature. And the best part, which is kind of dependent on your DM, is that the dragon looks like a real dragon, and creatures must use their action in order to determine if it's a real dragon or not. If they're able to succeed in an investigation check versus your spell save DC, they're able to determine that it's not a real dragon, and the only benefits they get from this is being able to see through it, and having advantage against its breath, which they still take damage from. So, based on your DM, the Illusory Dragon could soak a lot of damage as your enemies try to attack it, but as it's an illusion, it is completely immune to damage and all crowd control conditions. And if they find it suspicious, they have to waste a full action trying to investigate it. That investigation still might fail, while taking damage from its breath weapon every turn. However, if your DM is kind of a party pooper, they might immediately have all creatures try to perform an investigation check, and then have the ones that succeed just ignore the dragon and attack the rest of the party like normal, or even worse, have the first one to succeed tell all their allies it's an illusion and to not attack it, and have their allies immediately believe them without any hesitation. So it can be incredibly powerful if enough damage is wasted trying to attack it, but has the same issues as all illusion spells do, in that they're only really as good as your DM allows them to be. Luckily for Illusory Dragon, even baseline with one of the worst DMs who hates illusions and completely plays against them, the Illusory Dragon is still a pretty solid choice, as it can do a lot of damage over a couple of turns with its bonus action Breath Weapon. Although, whether the Illusion Dragon is better than something like Dominate Monster, a fully optimized Animal Shapes, or even Holy Aura, is definitely up for debate. But the potential of summoning a dragon that's immune to damage, can inflict a crowd control on summon, and deals damage every turn for a minute, is kind of hard to beat when it comes to always being useful whenever you cast it, which is why I think it's the number 1 8th level spell. 9th level spells are the highest level spells in the game, and since you usually don't get 9th level spell slots until level 17, most people don't get to use them very often. However, in case you do get to use them, here are some of the best ones you can possibly pick up. And at number 10, we have Psychic Scream. Psychic Scream is an AoE which affects up to 10 targets as you can see within 90 feet of you. And if they fail an intelligence saving throw, they take 14d6 psychic damage, and then they get stunned until they succeed that saving throw. And 14d6 damage for a 9th level spell slot is equivalent to casting Fireball at 9th level. So if all you care about is damage and you just like to upcast Fireball, then Psychic Scream will provide you the same amount of damage, while also having a stun component, and having a built-in no friendly fire clause, since it only affects targets of your choice, just as long as they have an intelligence score of 2 or higher, which most things do. And the cool thing about the stun is that it can theoretically last forever, as they don't get unstunned until they succeed an intelligence saving throw at the end of their turn. And also, if they die from the damage, their head explodes, which is just a neat bonus. However, there are some problems with this ability, mainly that it's compared to all other 9th level spells, and some of them are downright broken in comparison to a Fireball that can stun. And also, if you just want to deal damage, there's another 9th level spell which deals way more damage than Psychic Scream, but doesn't have a built-in friendly fire suppressor like Psychic Scream. Although even then, there are other lower level spells you can cast which deal more damage than Psychic Scream. So the main utility of picking up the spell is the fact that it has decent damage, since its damage is equivalent to a 9th level Fireball, and it has that stun component, which is definitely the most useful part of it. Although with how broken some of the higher spots are, you'll see why this is at the lowest spot at number 10. And at number 9, we have Invulnerability. This spell has a very simple effect, probably the least amount of attacks out of all the 9th level spells, where you're just straight up immune to damage until the spell ends. This spell itself lasts for 10 minutes and requires 500 gold to cast. However, when you're 17th level, 500 gold isn't that big of a deal. Although there is a little caveat to Invulnerability, in the fact that it only makes you immune to damage and nothing else. So if you're targeted by negative effects which might control your character, like a Psychic Scream and you fail the saving throw, then you can still be stunned. Or have your character mind controlled with the Dominate Monster, or even charmed by a 2nd level Suggestion. Although most monsters in the monster manuals don't have super fancy special effects, so being able to make yourself immune to damage for 10 minutes will basically make you invincible to a lot of enemies. And the fact that it requires concentration isn't a big deal if you never take damage. So if you're a wizard and you want to fight the warlord barbarian of an enemy kingdom one-on-one, you could probably beat them with a dagger as long as you're able to deal enough damage within 10 minutes, as they won't be able to hurt you. And the utility of becoming immune to damage for 10 minutes is just very good, especially since it can allow you to slowly whittle down any foe that doesn't have a way to control you outside of dealing damage. And at number 8, we have Mass Polymorph. This ability essentially allows you to cast the 4th level spell Polymorph on up to 10 different targets within 120 feet, and these targets can be friendly or unfriendly creatures, where if they're unfriendly, they can succeed a saving throw in order to not be forcefully transformed. And when you transform something by the Polymorph spell, the game statistics, including the mental ability scores, are replaced by the statistics of the chosen beast, which means if you mass polymorph a group of enemy targets, you can just choose to turn them into a whole bunch of rats, and then just kind of ignore them for the whole hour. So it's basically a way to instantly disable up to 10 enemy targets, or act as a buffer to some of your teammates. Now, Mass Polymorph doesn't work exactly like the normal Polymorph. There are a couple of key differences. For one, it allows you to turn a creature into a beast that has a challenge rating equal to its original challenge rating or lower, or if they are a player who has character levels instead, you can only turn them into a beast which has a CR rating equal to half or lower than their level. Whereas the original Polymorph spell allows you to transform a player into an animal that has an equal amount of CR. You see, challenge ratings are not equal to character levels, as generally a whole group of 5th level characters, for example, should be able to defeat a CR 5 creature if they work together. So if you're able to turn one character into a CR 5 creature at level 5, then they're instantly stronger than everyone else in their party, because the CR ratings are slightly balanced around being fought by multiple characters. CR ratings aren't super balanced though, so this is kind of a rough estimation. but a monster's CR is almost always stronger than a player's character of the same level. And the other difference is that it only grants the polymorph targets temporary HP instead of giving them a second health bar. So with the original polymorph, they basically get the health of the animal they turn into. And then if they lose that health, they transform back into the original state and still have their original health as well. With mass polymorph, it instead just gives a target a number of temporary hit points equal to that beast's health, which is a difference because it doesn't allow you to do power word kill shenanigans, while still providing a lot of extra hit points to chew through if you're using it on a friendly target to give them extra health. And since you don't really get 9th level spells until level 17 anyway, if you want to use mass polymorph on your friends, you can still turn them all into T-Rexes if you want, since the T-Rex is only CR 8, which is half of 16. Or giant apes if you want to keep their mental statistics, since the T-Rex only has an intelligence of 2, while the giant ape has an intelligence of 7, and is only 1 CR rating lower than a T-Rex. So if you want to turn everyone in your party into a T-Rex, I'm not sure how useful that would be if everyone's at 17th level, which is kind of why mass polymorph is lower on this list rather than one of the best. It is a neat 9th level spell, but as 9th level spells go, it's not as good as some of the better ones, which is kind of a theme for some of the earlier spots on this list. They do really amazing things, it's just they have to compete with some of the higher spots, which are even more amazing and downright broken. But if you really like the idea of turning your party into T-Rexes, that way you can get the extra 130 temporary hit points, then this is definitely something that could be done. Although most monsters you fight in tier 4 levels will be immune to the damage of a T-Rex, so there's always that to worry about. And at number 7, we have Time Stop. This ability allows you to stop time for 1d4 plus 1 turns, where you're able to take a number of turns equal to the amount of turns you're able to stop time, unless you do an action which affects another creature or object, or if you move more than 1,000 feet from where you cast a spell. So Time Stop can be an excellent way for you to just get out of any situation, because there's not much anyone can do about you stopping time and just running away. One of the most useful applications of the ability, though, is being able to set up a whole bunch of buffs on yourself, which is why there's lots of theory crafted online about which are the best abilities you can cast during a time stop, which make your character a lot more effective mid-combat, which is usually not possible unless you're able to prep before combat for whatever reason. So if you want to use Time Stop to just buff yourself, you can use it on things like Mage Armor, Mirror Image, Blur, Fire Shield, Invisibility, True Seeing, or even Crown of Stars. Generally, you want to go for buffs that don't require concentration, and then maybe one buff that requires concentration. If you want to use it to do damage, what you can do is just use every turn to cast O'Toole's Freezing Sphere into the little globe form. Then just have your fighter in the group come over to you and pick them all up and sling them at an opponent with their multi-attack. Or if you want a creative combo, you could cast Sickening Radiance on something and then just put them in a force cage, since Sickening Radiance doesn't actually affect the creature until their turn starts. It won't end the time stop prematurely. Alternatively, you can sub out Sickening Radiance with Cloud Kill, Delayed Blast Fireball, Bigsby's Hand, Contingency, or Faithful Hound, as all of those don't immediately end time stop either, and can be used before a force cage in order to trap a creature inside with one of those effects. So there's lots of fun things you can do in a time stop even with its limitations. Although it definitely requires a lot of prep work beforehand, since it's real easy to accidentally end time stop early if you're just blasting things. And at number 6, we have Foresight. This ability allows you to buff a creature so they gain advantage on all their attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws for 8 hours. Additionally, they can't be surprised, and other creatures have disadvantage on attack rolls against them. And since you can cast it on other people, and it doesn't require concentration, it's just an excellent spell to cast on one of your martial classes. More specifically, someone who has an ability like Sharpshooter or Great Weapon Master, where they regularly take a -5 to their attack rolls in order to deal much more damage. So if you give this to a fighter with Sharpshooter, they'll have advantage on all of their attack rolls and be much more likely to actually land some of those big hits, while also having really good protection since it gives them advantage on saving throws and disadvantage on attack rolls against them. It's basically one of the best buff spells you can give someone in a game, because the effect itself is just really good for pretty much every class, and it basically lasts for a full adventuring day. One of the problems with 9th level spell slots is that you usually only get one of them, so if that one spell's effect can benefit someone for an entire adventuring day, then you get a lot of mileage out of it, which just makes Foresight one of the good ones to pick up. And at number 5, we have Meteor Swarm. This ability is just a giant AoE, which with a 1-mile range allows you to designate 4 different points you can see, where each creature that's within 40-foot radius of those points takes 40d6 damage, half fire and half bludgeoning if they fail a saving throw, or half as much on a success. This spell only affects a creature one time total, so you can't petal one target 4 times. However, even with each creature only being hit once, Meteor Swarm is the hardest hitting single target ability in the game, dealing 140 damage on average, while also being a gigantic AoE. It has the potential to be the hardest hitting AoE spell as well, but Storm of Vengeance, another 9th level spell, technically hits way more targets, so it might lose out to Storm of Vengeance in doing the most amount of damage for a spell being cast, or maybe not. But whatever the case, if all you want to do is just use your 9th level spell slot for some bombastic damage, Meteor Swarm is the go-to spell. It just kind of blows Psychic Scream out of the water when it comes to dealing damage. Although Psychic Scream has the benefit where you can allow it to not hit friendly targets, whereas Meteor Swarm hits everything, and has such a large radius that this chance to hit one of your party members unintentionally is pretty high. And at number 4, we have Shape Change. This ability is like a polymorph that you can only cast on yourself, where you can turn into any creature that has a challenge rating equal to your level or lower, just as long as it's not a construct or undead, and you've seen that creature at least once. And what's great about this ability is it allows you to turn into things besides beasts, as generally, beasts in the monster manual are kind of balanced around the fact that they know players gain access to these beasts through a whole bunch of different kinds of spells and abilities. Other creatures don't really have these same balance restrictions or limitations. So most non-beast creatures are just stronger than other beasts of the same challenge rating. And Shape Change also allows you to keep your mental statistics, as you don't lose your intelligence, wisdom, or charisma score. But you gain the creatures pretty much everything else. Their health, special abilities, innate spellcasting if they have any, but not legendary actions or layer actions. And lastly, every turn you're allowed to change your Shape Change into something else, with the only restriction that you can't gain any more hit points than you gain from your first form. So you can't constantly swap forms in order to get a new health bar every turn. But you can swap forms to whatever you want every turn to gain new abilities or different innate spells. Because as a little distinction, you can't use a creature's spellcasting trait, but you can use the innate spellcasting trait if the creature has it. So if you turn into a Planeteer, for example, you're able to cast all of its spells since it has the innate spellcasting trait, just as long as none of them require concentration, because you're concentrating on a spell to do this. And the Planeteer is just a really good option to turn into, too. It can also use Healing Touch 4 times a day, it has passive True Sight, and the ability to passively know if someone is lying, so an excellent out-of-combat tool for social situations. It adds extra radiant damage to all of its attacks, and it has a baseline fly speed of 120 feet, which is really good. With this, you can fly and attack something and then go behind full cover every turn. Some other creatures you can turn into with innate spells include the Elder Brain, the Ultraloth, or the Rakshasa, in order to gain its limited spell immunity. You can also turn into a Purple Worm in order to create tunnels that your party can follow behind. You can turn into a Merilith to have a reaction every turn in combat, or just go into an adult gold dragon for fun, which is one of the strongest dragons you can turn into that you can possibly turn into at your level, which also has this shape change feature. You also gain the legendary resistances that a creature has, so every time you shape change into a new one, you get all of those new legendary resistances, as it doesn't prevent you from using those, only legendary actions. So shape change has a lot of really good creatures you can turn into in a lot of very versatile situations to kind of become a better creature than whatever your character is, honestly. And at number 3, we have Prismatic Wall. This is a spell which is kind of like a stronger Force Cage. It is definitely the final form of the spells which allow you to trap creatures or create barriers, like Wall of Force or Force Cage. And what it does is summon a wall that's 90 feet long, 30 feet high, and 1 inch thick. Or you create a sphere with a diameter of 30 feet. And wherever you designate the wall within 60 feet, if the wall passes through any creatures when it's forming, then the wall will just fail to form and your spell slot will be wasted. Which is kind of extreme since Force Cage just pushes creatures outside of it if it hits any creatures, but whatever. Prismatic Wall's pretty big, so you can pretty easily just put this over a creature, as long as it fits within the 30-foot dome if you're trying to trap it. When you create the wall, you can designate any friendly targets you want to be immune to its effects, so they can just pass through it no problem. And if an enemy creature tries to go through the wall, then it's subjugated to all 7 of its layers' effects, where each of its layers has its own description of what it does, and how much damage it deals, where it deals a total of 50 d6 damage if you go through all 7 layers, and has a chance to petrify, blind, and teleport a target to another dimension in the process. So it deals an average of 175 damage to a creature that walks through all 7 layers, and it's the ultimate spell in order to force creatures to walk through it. If you combo this with a reverse gravity trap, and place a dome above your opponent's enemies' heads, as you can put it in the air, then if they fail the reverse gravity and fall into it, they'll go through the wall 2 times as they fall into the air. Then you can just end reverse gravity in order for them to fall again through the 2 walls of the dome. And there's not too many creatures which can survive going through a prismatic wall 4 times. Alternatively, you can just create it like a wall and just get a lot of mileage out of abilities that allow you to push creatures through it, or just trap them in a dome, and you'll have 10 minutes before the wall goes away, since the wall can't be dispelled normally and is immune to anti-magic effects. Plus, one of the layers blocks all spells from going through. As the way you destroy the wall normally is you have to deal at least 25 points of cold damage to break its red layer. Then you have to use a strong wind in order to destroy its orange layer. Then deal 60 points of force damage to destroy the yellow layer. Just a reminder, with all these damage values, you kind of have to do all the damage at once, unless your DM allows you to deal the damage accumulative. So it's pretty obvious the yellow layer was designed to be hit with a disintegration spell. Then if you wish to break the green layer, you have to use the Pass Wall spell, which is a 5th level random spell that you probably won't have, or some similar effect in order to break it. Then you have to deal 25 fire damage to the blue wall, cast the Daylight spell or a similar spell in order to break the indigo wall, and finally, the violet wall can be broken with Dispel Magic. So the way you actually destroy this wall normally is akin to running a puzzle or encounter, and is an excellent spell to give a villain if you're a DM running a campaign, in order to force the players to work together finding ways to destroy the wall. Of course, if you're a player and just using this on an opponent, chances are an average enemy is not going to have all the beans to destroy all 7 layers, and we'll have to find some other way around the wall or just kind of brute force through all the damage and hope they don't get petrified. The Prismatic Wall has the potential to be one of the highest damage dealing single target abilities in the game, although it definitely requires creative use in order to force an enemy to actually try to go through it. And since you can designate friendly players to not be affected by the wall at all, you can just have your party members go in and out of the wall in order to attack and hide behind it for full protection. This powerful and incredibly complicated ability is definitely worth a 9th level spell slot, as you can kind of build a whole campaign around the ability to an extent, or at least make a very exciting final boss fight with it. And at number 2, we have True Polymorph. This spell allows you to turn a creature or object into any creature or object you want, although with a couple of rules and stipulations depending on what you're trying to turn them into, and also if you're able to maintain concentration on this transformation for a full hour, then the effect becomes permanent. So if you're level 17 and have the ability to cast this spell, what you can do is turn yourself into an adult gold dragon, and the gold dragon can use its shape change feature to turn into something else. So if you want, you can turn yourself permanently into an adult gold dragon, and then have the ability to use its shape change spell that I talked about earlier, basically an unlimited amount of times per day. And then once you get to level 20, you can instead turn into an ancient brass dragon, who is able to accomplish the same thing, although you'll only be able to turn to CR 20 and lower creatures. And some caveats to being able to shape change as a dragon is that the dragon shape change doesn't grant them any extra health, and also does not allow you to turn back into yourself with all of your spell slots, as True Polymorph completely replaces all of your statistics with the new form. So what you can't do is transform yourself into adult gold dragon, and then use its shape change feature to turn yourself back into your normal form in order to try to keep your spell slots, in addition to the new gold dragon's health. Although, if you turn into an adult gold dragon, and then use its ability shape change to turn into something else that has spells, like the Planeteer, then you can use those spells in that new form. So if you wanted to, you could just take about a week in order to turn everyone in your party into an adult gold dragon. That way they gain the benefits of the shape change ability, or just being a gold dragon with its breath weapons and strong melee capabilities. Or not, because they do lose their character statistics and can't really do anything else that the gold dragon can't already do. Now, outside of gold dragons, what you can also do with True Polymorph is transform objects into creatures. And an object transformed into a creature in this way is friendly to in your party for the full duration. Although after the effect's duration ends and the effect becomes permanent, then the creature itself gets to choose if it wants to stay friendly to you or not. And if you transform an object into a creature, it can only be CR 9 or lower. So this turns True Polymorph into basically a summon spell that allows you to transform a random rock or tree nearby into a CR 9 or lower creature. And some of the best creatures you can choose are the Young Silver Dragon, if you just want a beatstick. Or if you want some spells, you can transform them into an Evoker or an Abjurer, who have a lot of good spells that they can cast. The War Priest, if you need someone to heal your party, or the Shillelagh Kori, which has the ability to possess something or cast Dominate Monster. And if your party is just really good at convincing the creature to stay friendly to you, you could spend a full week in order to have an army of 10 young silver dragons at your beck and call. Or just a whole extra party of adventurers, if you give yourself a War Priest, Invoker, and then a Champion. And then finally, you can transform creatures into objects, just as long as they're not magical objects. So, if you simply transform an enemy creature into an object that is required as part of a spell component, since most of those aren't magic objects, which consumes that object as part of the spell component, like, say, a diamond worth 300 gold, which then can be used in order to cast Revivify, consuming the component and thereby destroying whatever creature you turned into an object. Although seeing as most boss monsters have legendary resistances, they'll probably just use it in order to avoid being turned into something. So this isn't an excellent way to instantly defeat a big boss monster, but it is a pretty metal way to defeat pretty much anything else. So, True Polymorph allows you to turn your whole party into adult gold dragons if you want, or if you have a whole bunch of sidekicks with you that you picked up through your campaign, you can turn them into adult gold dragons instead, or other dragons in case they have lower levels, so that your other level 17 party members don't lose all of their full abilities. Or you can create an army of young silver dragons by just turning rocks or trees into dragons, or just turning an enemy creature into a material component and then just consuming it to destroy them instantly. There's a lot of very strong things you can perform with the spell, which would probably make it one of the strongest spells in the game if it wasn't for the number 1 spot, because there's so many other things you can do with True Polymorph, like turn someone into the CR16 creature Titifilus, who can cast Animate Dead at will, so you can have your very own undead army. The limitations are pretty much up to whatever your DM allows you to do, because remember, if the only thing your DM requires of you is to have seen the creature in order to transform them into it, as the spell itself doesn't have that requirement even though Shape Change does, if you're a 17 level adventurer, you should have access to some kind of scrying or clairvoyance in order to see any of these creatures. And at number 1, we have the Wish spell. The Wish spell basically turns you into a reality warper, as by default, the spell allows you to cast any spell of 8th level or lower while ignoring its materials or cast time. And outside of that, you can instead just use Wish for whatever you want, but whether that succeeds is entirely up to your DM. So if your DM lets you do literally whatever you want with Wish, you could use the Wish spell to completely end the campaign immediately and have all of your characters retire rich. Although there's always a downside where if you try to wish for something outside of 8th level or lower spells, there is a 33% chance you won't be able to cast Wish ever again. So, let's go over some of the benefits of Wish if you only choose 8th level or lower spells to cast. One of the best things you can do is just cast Simulacrum, creating a copy of yourself. Then this new Simulacrum will have your 9th level spell slot, and you can use the Simulacrum in order to cast Wish for one of the options that's not an 8th level or lower spell. Normally, Simulacrum costs 1500 gold to cast and has a long 12-hour cast time. So you'd need the gold to do this for the first time, but you could just have your Simulacrum use the first Wish option to create 25,000 gold and then get your money back, and make a 23,500 gold profit, which can be used to fund more Simulacrums to cast more wishes. And your Simulacrum is a separate entity from you and can't regain spell slots, so if it loses the ability to cast Wish, that's not a problem, as you just create another one tomorrow. So if you have some prep, what you can do is create a new Simulacrum every day, then have that Simulacrum use one of the fun effects of Wish, under the options of what you can cast outside of spells, in order to grant everyone in your party resistance to all types of damage, 1 type per casting of the spell per day, or just summon an enormous pile of cash every day, 25,000 gold at a time. And you can also grant everyone in your party immunity to a spell for 8 hours, which you can do right before a big boss fight. And these are things you can do without your DM being able to invoke Monkey Paw shenanigans, as they are listed within the spell itself as things it can just do. If you try to do something else, then the spell itself encourages the DM to just judge whether the spell happens or not, or to do something creative with how it fails, or to simply tell you that the spell fails because of what you're trying to wish for is just too much. So granting everyone in your party resistance to all damage with the Simulacrum every day is something you can totally do with rules as written, although it's definitely one of the cheesiest things you can do. Alternatively, you can cast Hallow instantly, which normally has a 24-hour cast time, and can make it so 5 types of creatures can't harm your party, and also make it so enemy creatures have vulnerability to a type of damage of your choice. You can cast Resurrection without material components, in order to more cheaply bring someone back to life. You can cast Awaken on a tree in order to have a Trent, or cast a Planner Binding at 8th level in order to control a creature for 180 days. As you are able to cast the spell you're duplicating up to the 8th level instead of just its base level. So Wish is the ultimate spell, where it's even broken within its rules as written, and becomes even more broken if your DM is a lot more lenient with what they allow you to wish for. So Wish is easily the best 9th level spell in the game, and you can run your entire campaigns around characters trying to find items that allow them to cast the spell a single time.